Hello and good morning. Good morning, participants, both in person and live via Zoom statewide across California. Good morning, I'm Dr. Deborah Montoya from the Imperial County Office of Education, Imperial County SELPA. Wanted to thank you all for your patience, for all the good work that you do to serve students with disabilities and English learners across California. So our topic today is improving outcomes for English learners with disabilities. At Imperial County Office of Education, Imperial County SELPA, we are very grateful to be able to be in this space with you and work and advocate for students who are English learners and English learners with disabilities. Our work together with you as our collective commitment across the state with the California Department of Education and the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, who are our grantees, support our work in disseminating the information inclusion of the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. So just a few housekeeping measures as we participate via Zoom. And again, thank you for your participation, as I know many of you are being pulled away in so many directions to serve students and families across the state. So we are in a webinar format today, which is a little bit different. So you will be using both the Q&A feature as well as the chat feature. Feel free to engage with us, ask questions as we go along. We will provide plenty of opportunities for stopping, pausing, reflection, and asking questions. So do know that this is a full day session. Anything in the chat box will often query you for new learnings and wonderings. Feel free to enter those in the chat box. If you have a question related to any of the content that we share or a scenario, always ensuring confidentiality of your staff and students. And you may enter into the Q&A box any questions that you may have regarding the subject matter as we move forward. So again, the chat and the Q&A are open for all of our participants to assist us in engaging with you and ensuring that you receive the information you need out of our topic today. So again, I'm Dr. Deborah Montoya at Imperial County SELPA. I'm the Senior Director here at Imperial County SELPA. My experience that I bring to you as a former practicing school psychologist, having been a special education director for a local school district, followed by a principal, then senior director, and here at the SELPA after 20 years. So I'm very pleased and honored to be here with you and across the state. And with me, and right now moderating the chat and the Q&A, is Vanessa Lopez. Vanessa Lopez with a wealth of knowledge herself, over 20 years of experience as a special education teacher and English language learner coach. And as we work together, we again are honored to be able to share this information with you. In our trio, we also have Lupita Holguin Rubio, who will not be joining our session, but again, works in this space with us to assist and support. And I think you're seeing JC, if everybody wants to wave. We can't do it without our technology team who assists and supports us throughout this process again, so we can connect with you as we are very rural. And we want to ensure that we can spread the message and work collectively across the state in collaboration and support and leveraging of expertise, knowledge, and skills in improving outcomes for all English learners and English learners with disabilities. So on your screen, you do have a Padlet. The Padlet has all of the resources today and then some. So the presentation slides are there for your use and review with active links that are embedded. In the Padlet, you'll also find resources, infographics that we'll be touching upon as we continue through this process. So again, the Padlet is there. Feel free to remake it, share it with your colleagues, utilize it, adapt it at your respective school site as you see appropriate. Everything on the Padlet you can download, reformat again for your use to assist you in your practice. So where are we? You may be wondering, we are a very rural community out in the southeastern corner of California. If you're familiar with Mexicali Baja or Yuma, Arizona, much closer to there than our popular San Diego friends, which are pretty far up west. So that's where we are. But our work as a SELPA content lead within the California system of support is but one content lead. There is a content lead for CAPTAIN, effective practices for students with autism, equity and disproportionality over in South County SELPA, in addition to Placer County with open access, with all things assistive technology, our group members with the system leads and supports. And as we work together in this space, we want to ensure that we support not only SELPAs, but their respective LEAs, their county offices, your school sites specifically, that we hope our reach can again support all practitioners in the field, as again, we all need us together in working and supporting our English learners and ensuring they receive what they need in a timely fashion to ensure their progress and success. So as you look at the one system of support, again, we are one SELPA content lead here to assist and support you in the work that you do. If you would like to read more information about our work as connectors, collaborators, and facilitators, feel free to look over our one-page document. If you're an administrator, a SELPA, a county office, feel free to connect with us, as we may be able to share further resources and supports with you if you have questions regarding your respective programs, supports for English learners and English learners who are duly identified as English learners, students with disabilities. So just a little bit of information about our work. So let's get started with who are English learners and who are English learners with disabilities, to frame the information so that we all have a sound footing on, as we know, English learners, students who have a primary language other than English in their home. So students' primary languages other than English, and in that same subgroup, we know that we have students who are duly identified as English learners with a disability. In California specifically, we've seen that number rise and fall from time to time, and it's hovered between about 25% to 28% of English learners who are also students identified with a disability. So I'll use those terms interchangeably: dually identified students or English learners with disabilities. Our students with disabilities, when we do refer to students with disabilities, we're speaking specifically to students who have gone through the process of assessment, that valid and reliable practices occurred, and they were deemed and found eligible as a student within one of the 13 disability categories under IDEA. So English learners with disabilities are indicated as having a language other than English, and then as noted as having a disability. So we will first start discussing English learners and how students are identified as English learners and English learner status. We'll interchange from time to time and discuss processes regarding English learners and English learners with disabilities. But today our true focus in Chapter 1 will be looking at identification, initial ELPAC, summative ELPAC through this process, as we consider again whom are our English learners. The work that we share with you today is from the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. And I have to say that there were many experts who contributed to this document. We, again, are blessed to be the vehicle to share and disseminate, provide professional development surrounding the California Practitioner's Guide. So I cannot, again, commend enough the experts who worked, the California Department of Education, who headed this feature, both with their special education division and their multilingual support division, to ensure that, again, as a field, as a practitioners in the field, we have a foundational document, a resource for us to glean into. Nevertheless, we all recognize that this is a very robust document, full with many appendices, figures, resources that we will highlight during the series. So today is day 1 of a 5-part series, and all related to the California Practitioner's Guide. I do have to say, please note that aside from all of the mandates, the state mandates and statutes, federal statutes and mandates, when we review the Practitioner's Guide, you'll also see some exemplars. Yet refer to your local practices. Do connect. If you're an administrator, this will give you an opportunity to reflect upon what are your practices locally, both written and unwritten. If you're a school site, the same would be true. What are your practices? So again, in taking into consideration your board policies, your practices, your English learner master plan as well, we'll make references, but nevertheless, you'll need to review to what are your existing practices now, and where you might find entry points for refinement or some reassurance that your practices are appropriate and they are noted to be appropriate both for English learners and English learner students with disabilities. So just a note on that regarding the Practitioner's Guide. So as we set the context to where we've come from and where we are now. So just moving forward, as we know that there were statutes as Lau versus Nickel, Castañeda versus Pickard, and we know the inconsistencies, if you will. We know that unfortunately there were circumstances, and perhaps even now, Well, there are circumstances where students whom are English learners have not received the equity, the access to curriculum and instruction that we would hope for and anticipate. But what we see now is a trajectory towards access, ensuring equity for all English learners. So definitely wanted to highlight the 2012 English Language Development Standards. And you'll hear throughout our sessions, we will annotate the ELD standards, reflect upon their usefulness, their support, their structure, and how they can be utilized to assist all English learners as that is at the core of their instruction at Tier 1. The ELA-ELD framework, moving forward to a very important letter in 2015, solidifying and acknowledging the importance of both designated and integrated ELD, something you'll hear us mention ongoingly, which is comprehensive ELD, and the assurance that all students whom are English learners are entitled to comprehensive ELD as the core and the basis of their services. So as we look to multi-tiered systems of support, which we are participants of that multi-tiered support, in wanting to bring together resources across the state so that, again, dependent on where you are as a SELPA, as a county office, as a district, as a school site, to find the need and where you have a need to find that resource. So today, again, we thank you for allowing us to be with you in this space to discuss outcomes for English learners with disabilities, as it is our passion and priority. And thank you, because again, your commitment to participate with us today tells us that that is such for yourselves as well. So as we continue to move forward, we see again this annotation bringing to the forefront the needs of students with disabilities, the needs of students with disabilities whom are indicated to have needs as a result of dyslexia or specific learning disability. We then come to Prop 58, and that's where we start to truly move forward. With Proposition 58, we acknowledge again that global economy initiative, the supportive structures and the assets that English learners bring to our doorstep when they enter our schools, that we can assist and support students who have a primary language other than English in development of that language, to assist with bridging into English language acquisition, to give parents choice amongst programs. So as we see that and the principles that come with the English Learner Roadmap, and we'll touch upon the roadmap as well as we move forward, as again, foundational documents in our work. So as we go forward with the ELPAC, which took over for SELT, so SELT went away, we entered into ELPAC, and we'll touch a little bit upon the alternate ELPAC, which will be new to the field this year. And then in addition, as we look at our work in the statewide system of support, the launching of the California Practitioners Guide in 2019. So as we look at the California Practitioners Guide today, and our focus will be in Section 1, as we look at the tiers of support, as we look to understand the results, the information, the supportive structures that we can build with the utilization of data, specifically from the ELPAC, the alternate ELPAC, and how we use that to make informed decisions, how we form our intentional teaching in support of students whom are English learners and English learners with disabilities. So with that, we all come to the California Practitioners Guide. The resource in its entirety is included in your Padlet, but as I mentioned today, we'll focus on Section 1. Identifying, assessing, supporting, and reclassification is where we'll take you through this journey throughout the course of the series. But again, our focus today will be more on the identification and understanding our tiers of support as we look first to support our English learners within our system. So with that, we're going to jump into Chapter 1. My colleague Vanessa Lopez will be taking over at this point. I will moderate the chat. Again, please remember that we're here to support and engage, so feel free to enter any questions in the chat box or the Q&A. So thank you so much, and I'll hand it over to Vanessa as we lead into Chapter 1.
Thank you, Debbie. Good morning, everyone. We truly appreciate your patience this morning as we were working to resolve some of our technology issues. Let's get started by delving a little bit deeper into Chapter 1 of the California Practitioners Guide for Educating English Learners. So when we look at the California Practitioners Guide, we're looking at a vast document, upwards of 300 and some pages. So really going through the document itself is chock full of a myriad resources. However, it's important to provide practitioners different entry points. So when we look at the structure, we look at a document that is set up in 5 sections. Section 1, identification of ELs, MTSS, and pre-referral activities, which will be our focus for the day today. However, on our follow-up days, days 2, 3, 4, and 5 will be dedicated to sections 2, 3, 4, and 5 of said practitioner's guide. And it covers a range of topics from IEP development to reclassification to potential exit from special education services. So again, multiple entry points for whatever your role in improving outcomes for English learners with disabilities might be. So when we're looking specifically at Chapter 1, we're looking at the identification of English learners. So students who already have an active IEP who may be potential English learners. We'll also be looking at the multi-tiered systems of support and pre-referral interventions, all of those steps prior to considering assessment to determine whether a student might have a potential disability. But Chapter 1 itself is focused on students who already have an active IEP and who may be English learners, potential English learners. So when we're looking at Chapter 1, it is full of information related to the steps of initial identification, accessibility resources for students who will be assessing using the ELPAC, or if the IEP team determines any domain exemptions and or alternate ELPAC. We'll touch on these points a little bit more deeply as we spend some more time together. However, because we know that this is very important information, yet it can be overwhelming to process at first sight, we've developed a series of resources. So if you look off to the side with the questions addressed in this chapter, you will see a screenshot of one of our infographics. So we've developed companion infographics to work as a partner with the chapter of the Practitioner's Guide, which it's modeled after. So for example, this infographic that you see right here is specific to Chapter 1 of the Practitioner's Guide, and it covers the exact same topics that the Practitioner's Guide covers. What is one of the most salient features of this resource is that the links contained within are organized visually to support a learner, a practitioner who feels more comfortable with perusing information in a more visual manner, or who would need to couple text with images, because again, we like to practice what we preach, considering all learners, and as practitioners, we're constantly learning and developing our own knowledge. So this infographic is aligned directly to the Practitioner's Guide and presented in the very same order. Chapter headings and images are linked directly back into the Practitioner's Guide, where you may access this information. Later on, time permitting, we may go through some of these infographics more in depth and how to access them and where to access them. In the meantime, these are present within your Padlet, and you should be able to access them for chapters 1 through 7, with chapter 8 and 9 still being in the works. So let's zero in on Chapter 1. So when we're talking about Chapter 1, this chapter describes how students with disabilities may also be classified as English learners. Again, that level of dual identification, dually identified learners, using appropriate assessments and accessibility resources and placed in a language acquisition program. So this, in a nutshell, is what we'll be covering today with Chapter 1. How students with disabilities may be classified also as English learners, dually identified, and appropriate assessment accessibility resources, as well as language acquisition programs. These are the 3 tenets that we'll be focusing in on with Chapter 1. So Chapter 1 kicks us off with the home language survey. So students who were born elsewhere in the US, wherever they might have been born, upon initial enrollment in school are required to complete the home language survey. So the home language survey, I want you to think of it not as much as a questionnaire, but more as a guide for discussion. And these are reflective points where 4 essential questions in identifying potential English learners come into play. So the very first question is, which language did your child learn when he or she began to talk? That initial language, first question. The second question is, which language does your child most frequently speak at home? Again, first question, the first language the child spoke. Second question, Which one is the language most frequently spoken at the home by the child? The third question, we're focusing in now on you, being the parent or the guardian. Do you most frequently use when speaking to your child? And number four, which language is most often spoken by the adults in the home? Regardless of who it is that lives with the child at home, what is that language that those adults use to communicate with the child? And this home language survey is completed only once by the parent guardian. And it's upon initial enrollment, whether that initial enrollment occurs in TK, third grade, ninth grade, or 12th grade. Upon initial enrollment, this questionnaire is completed. This survey is completed to help establish and or determine if this is a potential English learner. Depending on how families or guardians answer this, the home language survey, that kicks off another set of steps that move us further in our journey in identifying students as potential English learners as well. So again, if a language other than English was indicated in any of those questions of the home language survey, we really want to consider assessing the student. As a matter of fact, it is required that if any of these questions are answered with a language other than English, that a student is assessed. And that kicks off the initial ELPAC or the alternate ELPAC. The alternate ELPAC will be coming into full effect, but previously you might have used the VCALPs to establish English language proficiency, and this is done within 30 calendar days of enrollment. So those first 30 days of enrollment is where this process takes place. And the performance on the ELPAC will establish if the student is classified as an English learner or as an initial fluent English proficient student. So important distinction there. When we're talking about a student who is initially fluent English proficient, that means that they are not to be classified as an English learner. It's the whole IFIP. Those of you that have caseloads and you're looking at language designation, if you see IFIP, that's what it means. Initial fluent English proficient, meaning that upon administration of that initial ELPAC, it was just determined that the student's English language proficiency is commensurate to that of an English learner and is now considered as being initially fluent English proficient. Whereas if the opposite were to be true, then the student would be determined or identified as being an English learner. So again, if any of those first three questions of the language other than English identified as that language spoken at the home or by the student kicks off this process, which then will take us to the determination of English language proficiency of the student. So what I'm sharing with you right now is the SEMPL Student Score Report, the SSR. This SSR is, again, of a fictitious student, not a real student, but I wanted you to take a look at what this summary, this report contains. So when the student takes the initial ELPAC, it will generate a report. Different sites have different practices where these are emailed to parents, where these are sent out from the school, where teachers can access these online or may request them from their assessment offices or whatever structures are set up to request assessment documents. But this one is specific to the initial ELPAC. So I'm going to walk you through this document. So when we're looking at the student score report, I want us to pay attention to the very first rectangle right here, which indicates an overall performance level and score. So when we're looking at that, we see that this student, this sample student, was identified as being initial fluent English proficient with an overall score of 600. Off to the side, we have some information that details what the child's score means. So again, based on the results, this child is considered to be fluent in English. Therefore, the student will not have to take the summative ELPAC in the spring. Summative ELPAC being that annual ELPAC that is taken year after year to measure growth and or mastery in English language proficiency and or development. So if we look across to this very next page, it gives us a breakdown, a visual breakdown of the overall performance level of this student, knowing that, of course, the student was not an English learner, having been identified as being initially fluent English proficient. So the score of 600, it tells us that it's an overall performance level score. However, the 4 domains assessed in this initial ELPAC are the oral language composite, which is listening and speaking, and the written language composite, which is reading and writing. So in both language composites, oral and written, the student has well-developed skills. That tells us that this student will not need to take the ELPAC. However, we also know that students whose primary language may be other than English might still require many types of linguistic supports depending on task or purpose. It's critical to remember that, that depends on what is being asked of the student to do and what that purpose might be and what the task may look like. However, if we stay focused on this particular student, and if we look at this section, it's clearly identifying where the student is and what they can do at each level. So this student, who was initially fluent English proficient, has well-developed oral and written language skills and can use English to learn and communicate in meaningful ways, and may occasionally need help in English. Again, task and purpose. And let's not forget that at this point, we're talking about students who are identified as qualifying for special education services under one of the 13 specific disability categories. So right now we're talking about linguistic supports related to English language proficiency, but let's not lose sight of the fact that these students have a learning disability, might have qualified for services under OHI, perhaps under ID. Remembering all of these points is critical in determining what instruction is going to look like for the student and on the task or purpose with which they are encountered in various classroom settings. So going back to the initial assessment of English language proficiency, these are very important notes. So parents and guardians cannot opt out of taking the initial ELPAC. However, what they can do is they can make a request to change the home language survey responses prior to that initial ELPAC or prior to it being scored. Again, the code is listed down there that details the specifics to this. And also, a certificated employee of the LEA may request a review of the student's classification prior to taking the summative ELPAC. Again, important points to remember related specifically to the initial assessment of English language proficiency. So the California Practitioner's Guide identifies some promising practices, implications, and strategies for administrations and teachers as they relate to the initial assessment of English language proficiency. So we want to make sure that districts have experts training school staff. We want to engage in informal interviews with parents to get to know more about the students, more about the home environment, more about the culture, more about the language to develop a more robust student profile. We want to perhaps establish an English learner classification committee where experts in English language development, English language proficiency, and all things related to English learners are present and sharing their expertise. Additionally, we want to have classification and decision-making and consultation with peers. So again, and the parents. We want to make sure that parents are involved throughout and that when we're having these discussions on decision-making specific to the needs of English learners and initial assessments, as we're touching on right now, that parents are actively involved, engaged, and have meaningful participation. So we know that sometimes there may be misclassifications. So California has an approach for detecting and correcting misclassification of English learners. So the very first one is if a student is classified as English only, but the LEA has an indication that the student's primary or native language is not English, and the student is unable to perform ordinary classroom work in English, the LEA may collect and review evidence. The second scenario presented here is that if an LEA administers the initial ELPAC to a student who is not eligible, the student's classification shall remain unchanged, regardless of the assessment results. And finally, number three, the third scenario is that after the administration of the initial ELPAC, but before the student takes the summative ELPAC, and at the request of the student's parent or guardian, or a certificated employee of the LEA shall collect and review evidence about the student's ELP. You can find additional information related to detecting and correcting misclassifications in Chapter 1 of the Practitioner's Guide, and that'll help you develop a better understanding of what the steps are related to the detecting and correcting misclassification of students as English learners. Which takes us to the ELPAC. We talked about the initial ELPAC, but now we're going to look at the second purpose of the ELPAC. So the ELPAC is both initial and summative annual. Two different assessments though. Measure the same thing, but they're not the same. So the initial ELPAC is not the same as the summative ELPAC in content. It still measures English language proficiency in all 4 domains. But now we're going to look at that measurement of annual growth through the summative ELPAC to determine English language proficiency for the student year to year. So the summative ELPAC, the scores are used to measure, identify, and determine. We are measuring a student's yearly progress in reaching English proficiency. The second thing it does is that it helps identify the student's English language proficiency, the ELP level, and how this relates to the English language development standards. Those 2012 ELD standards are completely aligned with the ELPAC, and it gives us information regarding to that. And also, it helps us determine eligibility for reclassification. On day 5, we're going to touch upon all things reclassification, and ELPAC scores definitely play an integral role in determining whether the student has met the criteria for a reclassification pathway, depending on the pathway that is identified for the student based on their individual needs and what the IEP determines as being appropriate for the student. So again, measure, identify, determine. So the ELPAC, many of us are completely familiar with the ELPAC. Some of us are barely getting to know what the ELPAC is, what the ELPAC does. So we've included a graphic that helps explain what goes into the ELPAC and how these components give us that overall ELPAC score. So central to the discussion of the ELPAC is understanding that the ELPAC generates an overall ELPAC score. However, that overall ELPAC score is determined by the 4 domains: listening, speaking, reading, and writing, with each domain having a score of its own. Additionally, when we look at the graphic presented up here, we're looking at this blue line which runs vertical. So off to the side, top to bottom, we have receptive language. Listening, reading. Off to the side, we have expressive, meaning expressive language, speaking, and writing. Now, if we take a look at this orange line, this divides it into the performance areas. Oral language, which is speaking and listening, and then written language, writing and reading. What's important to remember about this graphic is that it helps us start building a picture of what the student can and cannot do. Right now with the image, it doesn't give us much context, but as we move forward and take a look at the summative ELPAC SSR, the sample student score report, we are going to see how this helps develop our understanding of where the student is in regards to language proficiency, and it starts helping inform our student profile, our robust student profile, as we start considering assessment needs and classroom needs as the student progresses through the years in our school system. So figure 1.1 talks about English language proficiency. We're looking at the relationship between the ELPAC performance levels and the ELD standards proficiency levels. So 2 different things. So when we're talking about the ELPAC performance levels, it's different from the ELD standards proficiency level. So this graphic, what it does is it aligns the 2. So when we're looking at the ELPAC performance level on this very first column, we're looking at what the student scores as on the ELPAC, whether it be level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. Level 1 being minimally developed, level 2 being somewhat developed, level 3 being moderately developed, and level 4 well developed. That gives us an understanding of a hierarchy of scores. However, if we're looking more to identify the types of linguistic supports that the student might need, we really want to look at the ELD standards proficiency level. So when we're looking at the ELD standards proficiency levels, we're looking at basically 3. However, because it's aligned with the ELPAC performance level, we have to split it up somewhere in the middle, and I'll show you where that happens. So in the ELD standards proficiency level, we have the emerging level, which means that a student at the emerging level requires substantial linguistic support, meaning more structured language support, more primary language support, depending on the individual student, which might look in a variety of ways, because if we're considering the fact that these are students with a disability, we need to consider communication needs as well, and what might communication look like for individual students, whether it requires the involvement of picture cards, whether it requires an AAC device or any other communication device. Considering what that might look like and how that might align is critical. So as we continue further down the ELD standards proficiency level, we have expanding, requiring moderate linguistic support, and expanding and bridging, requiring moderate to light linguistic support. So again, here's where we look at that one ELD standards proficiency level that's broken up into 2 parts. So we have the expanding, which aligns with level 2, somewhat developed, and expanding/bridging that aligns with moderately developed, requiring moderate to light linguistic support. And what makes the difference here is task and purpose, right? Again, going back to task and purpose, going back to disability category, manifestation of the disability category, and manifestation within a variety of settings, because we know that it might look different in a mathematics classroom, that it might look in a perhaps history classroom during a science lesson versus during an ELD lesson. So again, considering that intersection of disability and English language proficiency is key as we strive to support dually identified students. And finally, we get to bridging, the bridging ELD standards proficiency level. And students at the bridging level need light linguistic support. Again, always considering that task and purpose, right? So if it's completely new content, maybe the level of support might be a little bit more along the lines of moderate support, but considering the individual student, this is meant to be a table that orients us to the alignment of the ELPAC performance level and the ELD standards proficiency level more than a structured way to provide it. It's just to give us an idea, a starting point as we start aiming to address the needs of students and that manifestation of disability and English language proficiency. So as we're looking at the spectrum, right, as we're looking at the stages of English language development, we put this image together that's linked to that which is presented in the ELD standards and the ELA-ELD framework, because we want to establish a visual understanding of these different stages and how they move across from native language to emerging, to expanding, to bridging, to being a lifelong language learners. So English learners, we know, come to school with a wide range of knowledge and competencies in their primary language, which they use to draw upon to develop their English. So again, when students come into our classrooms with their native language, it's not just their native language. It is what they bring, it's an asset, and we should use that accordingly as we're aiming to develop English language proficiency. When we look at emerging, we know that English learners at this level typically progress very quickly. They're learning to use English for immediate needs, quote unquote, becoming BICY, using those BICs, as well as beginning to understand and use academic vocabulary and features of academic language. So we start seeing some rapid growth as they're going from utterances to single words to simple sentences here in that emerging stage. And then finally, expanding. English learners at this level increase their English knowledge skills and their abilities in more contexts. They're able to generalize a little bit more. They have a greater variety of academic vocabulary, grammatical forms and functions, grammatical structures, and discourse practices in more sophisticated ways. When we move on to bridging, English learners at this level continue to learn and apply a range of advanced English language skills and abilities in a wide variety of contexts, and are producing highly complex texts, processing these texts as well. Additionally, students who are bridging, they are bridging into the transition to full engagement at grade level with that English language proficiency that allows them to partake in content area activities without the needs of specialized instruction. And finally, it takes us off to the end of the spectrum, which is the lifelong language learner. So lifelong language learners have reached full proficiency in English language as determined by local criteria, and they continue to build increasing breadth, depth, complexity, and comprehending and communicating in English in a wide variety of contexts as well. Again, knowing that a student who has a disability, who has an active IEP, who is receiving special education services, related services, and might have one or more disabilities, that also plays a role in how we interpret these stages of English language development. So when we go back to looking at those specified linguistic supports, we have this graphic here that aligns also with the proficiency level descriptors. So if a student is at the emerging level, they're going to require substantial linguistic supports. If students are at the expanding level, they're going to require moderate linguistic supports. When at the bridging level, they might require light linguistic supports. Because we're talking about high-level thinking, providing access to high-level thinking with those linguistic supports. English learners possess cognitive abilities appropriate for their age and experience, but in order to communicate about their thinking as they're learning English, they may need varying degrees of linguistic support, depending on their linguistic and or cognitive demand of the task, as well as the purpose. So again, being aware of how the English language proficiency level aligns with the type of linguistic support is going to be critical. So for example, a student at the emerging level is going to require substantial supports. And really what it is that students can engage in complex, cognitively demanding social and academic activities requiring language when provided supports that help develop more familiarity and ease in English. And the support might be moderate or light, again, depending on topic. So if the topic is new, it might require additional supports. But if it's something that they're familiar with, then it'll be more of a lighter support. So again, task and purpose plays a critical role. Intersection of disability and language proficiency also plays a critical role. And also context, where is it that the student is being asked to produce? And also keeping in mind those language composites, the written, the oral, and also keeping in mind, is it a receptive task or is it an expressive task? So figure 1.3 of the California Practitioner's Guide goes a little bit more in depth with standards proficiency level descriptors. If you're looking to look at the language descriptors a little bit more deeply, figure 1.3 provides that resource. So figure 1.3, as well as other appendices and other figures that we'll be referencing through our time together today and over the next four more sessions, are contained within the California Practitioner's Guide. So they're pulled from the Practitioner's Guide, but we've also separated them and made them available as downloads, printables within our website. And again, these are included in the Padlet. So if you see any figures or any appendices that speak to you that might be appropriate for any kind of COP or PLCs that you may have planned in the future, community of practice, professional learning communities, feel free to access these. Again, these are included in the Padlet and can also be found in our website as well as within the California Practitioner's Guide. All of that to get us to the interpretation of summative ELPAC scores. So I want to spend some time looking at the sample student report for the summative ELPAC. We looked at the initial one. That sample student was identified as being initially fluent English proficient, therefore not an English learner, therefore not requiring the summative ELPAC. Now we're looking at a sample score report for a student who is an English learner who has taken the summative ELPAC the year prior, and this is the results generated as a 5th grade student. So if we look up here, again, fictitious student, not real. But what I want us to look at is this middle section on this first page. So page 1, page 2. On page 1, it gives us an overall score. We have the level, and then we have a scaled score. So this student scored as a level 3. This means that the student is then identified as having moderately developed English language proficiency with a scaled score of 1525. So important to remember, and it's highlighted right here as well, is that a child's ELPAC results are only one measure of the child's knowledge and skills in English. Other measures that need to be considered are classroom tests, homework, and grades. Knowing this information, I want to draw our attention to this bottom section, because it is here that then we start understanding a little bit better what that level 3 might mean. Those of us that were caseload managers or who are working directly with students with disabilities know that in the development of our IEPs, we have to include student scores. And oftentimes we put the numbers in there, we might write it out, moderately developed, but sometimes I find that what's lacking is a full understanding of what those scores mean and the direct implications to instruction, to our pedagogy, to aligning and designing instruction for students, whether it be in content areas or English language development courses, both designated and or integrated. And here is where it starts to make sense. So if we look at level 3, look on down here, find that level 3 meets moderately developed. Yep, I can see that. What this means is that students at this level can usually use English to learn new things in school, usually, right? So that already lets me know that this is going to be dependent on task and purpose. That's where that usually comes in. So whether it's new content, familiar content, whether it's in a content area that the student struggles with because of X, Y, and Z, whether it's in language arts because it's a lot of writing assignments and the student qualified under SLD, specific learning disability and has an academic area of need writing. So again, that's giving me some feedback, that's giving me some information that I want to consider as I start developing my understanding of who the student is and the language assets they bring and how these translate into their attainment of English language proficiency. Moving over across to the second page, this gives us more information now. So if we think back to the ELPAC image that I shared where I had the overall score in the middle and then we divided it into written language, oral language, receptive, expressive. Here's where all of that starts making sense and coming together as we're developing further this picture of who this child is. So student was a 3. And there are 3 in the oral language composite. So it's called an oral language composite because it's made up of the 2 domains within the oral language composite, which is listening and speaking. So I want to draw your attention to this image right here. In listening, this particular student scored or was identified as well developed. Their listening skills are well developed. Okay, now speaking, they're at somewhat moderately developed. That is already giving me some feedback, some information in considering what the language needs, the linguistic support needs of this student. I know that when we're talking about oral language, their listening skills are well developed, whereas their speaking skills are moderately developed. So I'm already thinking listening is a receptive language skill. So I know that receptive language for this student in relation to listening is well developed. So I'm already thinking, okay, if I'm considering an assets-based approach, I'm keeping this in mind. Listening is a strong suit. This is a platform upon which I can build on. So I start thinking of ways to connect to allow the student to then demonstrate what it is that they know. And it also gives me a clue that I will require more supports in the speaking. So considering what those supports might look like in relation to their English language proficiency and disability category. Case in point, considering all students, right? Some of us work with students who have a very difficult time engaging in tasks that relate solely around speaking. So I'm thinking back to a situation with a student who perhaps had some anxiety issues, who at times demonstrated some difficulty in communicating and presenting for whatever reason, whether related to their disability or not, because again, we've been talking about disability category and English language proficiency, but we also have to consider learner variance. So keeping that in mind is also going to help us develop a more robust idea, picture, profile of our student and how we can align our design of lesson delivery and instruction, our pedagogical practices. So keeping that in mind is going to be important in relation to English language development for the student. Next, if we look at written language, the composite score was a 3, scaled score was 1560, okay? So written language appears higher than oral language, okay, all right. So that's already giving me some clues also that although they're moderately developed in both areas, this seems to be a little bit more developed than the oral language composite. However, that's relative, right? Now let's look at what makes up the written language composite. We're looking at reading and we're looking at writing. So these two domains, reading and writing, appear to be commensurate. They're both at somewhat moderately developed. So that already has me thinking, okay, so in this section, they're probably truly a 3. They are going to require the same type of linguistic supports. It won't be substantial, it won't be light. They're most likely in that moderate linguistic supports. However, if I look closely at this little icon here, this little graph, if I look at the tick mark, it's a little closer to that level 2, somewhat developed. So the composite at level 3 is closer to that level 2 than being smack dab in the middle of a level 3. And if I remember back to the graphic where we aligned English language proficiency related to the ELPAC and then the ELD descriptors, proficiency descriptors, then there we know that sometimes we might require more moderate or substantial supports. So I might need to provide a lot more of those substantial supports depending on task or purpose. Again, could this be related to the disability category, the manifestation of the disability? Perhaps, maybe yes, maybe not. But considering all of these things, again, gets us in that reflective mode where we engage in more nuanced conversations as we consider what students bring into our classroom and that intersection of language proficiency and disability. Finally, here we have this student's ELPAC score history. So as we mentioned earlier in the previous slides, where one of the purposes of the summative ELPAC is to measure growth, a lot of times when we're thinking about accountability measures, this is what we're looking at. So at face value, it may look that the student made no growth. They stayed a level 3, right? So by staying at that level 3, we might think that no growth is being made there. However, if we look at the prior year scores being 1495 and this year being 1525, then some growth could be gauged there. However, we want to check also if there's changes in those scaled scores, because oftentimes, we don't know exactly what might have been going on that particular day, how these scores might reflect. And again, going back to our previous slide, this is just one measure. It's just one measure to get us thinking, to get us considering what it is that students bring to the table in relation to their English language proficiency, knowing that it is not the one thing. Because English learners are a diverse group. We're talking about English learner typologies. We have students who are newly arrived with adequate schooling. We have students who are newly arrived with limited formal schooling, students who are developing normally, students who are long-term English learners, or students who are at risk of becoming long-term English learners. So considering all of these EL typologies is important because we just went over that summative ELPAC student score report. Let's think back and let's pretend it was a 1. So a 1 for a student who is newly arrived with limited schooling versus a 1 for a student who's a long-term English learner really again calls into question a lot of considerations as we're determining the types of linguistic supports that are going to be required and the implications as they relate to disability category as well. So knowing that a level 1 is not always a level 1. It's going to look different. It's going to depend on a lot of issues related to the individual student and what their needs might be. All of that to get us to the point in the conversation where we address comprehensive English language development, comprehensive ELD. So comprehensive ELD is really 2 types of ELD. There's integrated ELD and designated ELD. So an integrated ELD occurs during regular class time, where the ELD standards work in tandem with the focal standards from the Common Core State Standards, whether they be for ELA, math, science, etc. Whereas designated ELD, and designated ELD, we're talking about a protected time where the ELD standards are the focal standards, where the focus here is for students to develop critical English language skills and those abilities needed for content learning in English. So again, comprehensive ELD, 2 types of ELD. Integrated throughout the day, ELD standards in tandem with content standards, whereas designated ELD is a protected time with the ELD standards as the focal standards. So we've talked a lot and you've listened a lot. So we've earned a stretch break. I'm gonna go ahead and give you some time to process, decompress, refill that cup, send out a couple of emails. I know we're all incredibly busy, and we'll see you back in a couple of minutes. How are we doing on time? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? 10 minutes? All right, so we'll take a 10-minute break and we'll see you back at 10:08, if my math is correct. So we're aiming to address every single question that's coming up in the Q&A and in the chat as well. If you notice in the chat, I dropped in a couple of links. Some of you had questions related to the ELPAC score range and how it's possible that some scores might seem higher but are actually lower. So I dropped the link to the ELPAC score guide, specifically pages 30 through 31, where you can see that how these change, how these composites change, and also that these may change from year to year. So you may access that link, look at pages 30 through 31, to look at how it is that those levels are broken down, not just within domains and composites, but also from grade level to grade level. So now we talked about ELPAC, the test, what it measures, how to read a score report. But now we're going to touch upon California assessment accessibility resources. So because we're talking specifically about English language learners, students with an active IEP who are dually identified, we're going to take a look at accessibility resources in all areas. But right now we're going to start with students who may not have an active 504 plan or an IEP plan. These students still have access to these accessibility resources, only if they are universal tools and designated supports. And I will refrain from using the pointer because you guys can't see my pointer in Zoom land, so I apologize for that. So when we're looking at that first blue rectangle, universal tools, these are tools that are available to all students on the basis of student preference and selection. For the most part, these are accessibility resources that don't need to be quote unquote turned on. They're already embedded within the testing interface. So these are available to all students with or without disabilities, with or without a Section 504 plan or an IEP. If we look at the larger rectangle now, accessibility resources that fall under designated supports are also available to all students when determined for use by educators or a team of educators with, again, parental input as appropriate or specified in the individual's IEP. So designated supports, although the bottom section of that rectangle talks about students with IEPs, designated supports are not only for students with an IEP or a Section 504 plan. Designated supports are available to all students, including students with an IEP and a 504 and or a 504 plan. Same thing with universal tools. So if you think of these accessibility resources as UDAs, universal tools, designated supports, accommodations, it's going to help you sort of organize who uses what in relation to assessment accessibility resources specific to the ELPAC in our conversation today. So we have a nice video here on the importance of implementation CASP and ELPAC accessibility resources. And these are educators speaking about CASP and ELPAC accessibility resources. We're going to give it a go and hope that our video cooperates so that you may view and listen.
This video, The Importance of Implementing CASP and ELPAC Accessibility Resources, Voices from Educators, is brought to you by the California Department of Education. Understanding what students know and can do is essential to making good decisions about student learning, which is why California state assessments offer accessibility resources ensuring all students have equal access to assessment. For the California Assessment of Student Performance and Progress, or CASP, and English Language Proficiency Assessments for California, or ELPAC. These include universal tools, available to all students, designated supports, available to some students who have an identified need, and accommodations, available to specific students with needs documented in an individualized education program, or IEP, or a 504 plan. We spoke to California educators to learn more about the importance of implementing accessibility resources for assessments.
My name is Erin Gordon. I'm the Director of Assessment Services for San Diego Unified. When we have students who have a need and we can match that with the available accessibility resources, it gives that student access. But for us as educators, it gives us a more accurate measure of what they know and what they can do. It's a truer reflection of that student's knowledge and skills.
As part of our mission to provide a world-class education for all students, we want to remove barriers so that all students have equal access to quality instruction and assessment.
We want all students to have equity and access to learn. And so when we talk about assessment, effective assessment, and the appropriate accessibility resources, that's a powerful tool to advance equity.
So I'm Veronica Maxwell. I am the principal at Burbank Elementary School in San Diego Unified School District. When my teachers found out that they were indeed able to use these accessibility supports for all of their students, They were very happy. They were excited to find out that now, not just their students with IEPs, but all of their students were able to access the supports that they needed.
My name is Sam Avalos. I'm a fifth grade teacher at Burbank Elementary School. Yeah, when our new principal came in, she actually told us about this. We were not aware, and so it was like a life-changing moment for us, really, because we thought that this was only available for special day students, and when she told us, no, this is available for any student, we were really excited about it.
I do feel that last year was the first year we really utilized these, and our scores increased significantly. Part of the reason was that they were able to use and practice having these resources available to them during the assessment.
These are available resources, and there is no penalty. It's giving students access without interfering with what's being measured.
Ensuring that students have appropriate accessibility resources is a journey that requires awareness and educator support through professional development.
I'm Heather Potter. I'm the principal at Knox Middle School in San Diego.
And I'm Brandon Bala. I'm an ed specialist also at Knox Middle School.
As we transition to CASP testing over the years, our district has a wonderful assessment department, and they provided professional development for all administrators and testing coordinators. So through those learning experiences, we were able to learn more about the resources ourselves. And as we did that, we were able to guide our teams back at our school site into teaching them so that they were able to really understand what was available for our students. So I believe the professional development that we received was very important in getting started.
So we take our participants in our training through this entire journey, and we cover those three main topics: what's available, and then what can we do to determine what's going to be effective and appropriate for different students, and then finally, how do we collect that, and what kind of process can we put in place so that we can get the information into TOMS and before the summative assessment.
In addition to supporting teachers, students need opportunities to understand and use accessibility resources such as color contrast, masking, and strike-through.
It's been very important for my students to have the ability to give us feedback and choose the supports that work best for them. We didn't go into this just assigning at random where everybody was going to get the text-to-speech or everybody was going to get the color contrast. We really had time to really think about it ahead of time, and then let our students also let us know, did that work for you? Did that not work for you?
For our students, it was also very important for them to take the practice test, because with the practice test online, they are able to sample some of the resources that are available for them, and students are able to then give input, having seen it in a different kind of environment before we actually take the real test.
The first steps to getting started are having committed leadership and obtaining the facts and information related to accessibility resources.
My name is Eileen Moreno, and I am the principal of Edison Elementary in San Diego Unified School District. I got started with this process by doing a lot of reading, but I felt that it was important for me to be very, very knowledgeable about how the accessibility resources work and how they could help our students. I watched videos on our district website, I watched videos on the CASP website, and so I basically made it my job to be as knowledgeable as I could about the accessibility resources so that I can properly explain them to my teachers and then also answer any questions they might have.
A principal is key in implementing the accessibility resources. They play a significant role in this process. It's the principal who's going to set the stage. They're the instructional leader. They're leading their staff. They're the ones who can carve out time in the schedule so that their teachers can sit, they can learn, they can collaborate, identify the needs of the students and match those with the available resources. So all of this is really important work, and the principal is the one that can make this happen at their school sites.
Also being very helpful is the time given to us at school and helping prepare and get ready and collaborate with each other in order to go over some of those ISEP pages and figuring out what we can do to provide better resources for our students.
It's important for students to have these resources because they shouldn't be hindered by the design of a test. We need to make sure that we are supporting them by using any supports that won't negatively impact the results. Technology has made it possible to offer supports that were never available before. So if the supports are there and they're going to positively impact the results, why not use them?
You can learn more about student accessibility resources and test settings by visiting casp.org and elpac.org. Special thanks to the educators from the San Diego Unified School District.
So as mentioned in the video, we want to make sure that we consider the students, the individuals, and how they're going to be accessing these resources. So a good starting point is the matrix, the California Assessment Accessibility Resources Matrix. Some of you might remember that it used to be 2 documents, Matrix 1 and Matrix 4. Well, now they've come together. They've been together for a while now, and it has recently been updated, and that's included in an assessment Padlet that we're also sharing with you. We'll drop down in that chat, and it's also linked within our resource Padlet. But another good partnership of this document is the one that is made with the 2 graphics at the bottom, which are the computer-based and the paper pencil accessibility resource graphic for the ELPAC. So as mentioned before in the video and in a previous slide, we have 3 basic designations for accessibility resources: universal tools, the U, designated supports, the D, and accommodations, the A. U's and D's are available to all students. In the video, you heard that those designated supports are for some students. That doesn't mean that a student requires an IEP or a Section 504 plan or an SST recommendation. The recommendation that a student might benefit from a designated support can come from a teacher, from a practitioner that works directly with the student, from the IEP team if the student has an IEP team, if there is an SST team. However, it is not required that you have it specifically in writing as a recommendation, but those practices may change from school site to school site. And as always, we encourage you to reach out to your school site administrator to see what the steps for making those recommendations for designated supports are, but know that these are available to students and do not require the existence of a Section 504 plan or an IEP. So those would be those first 2 blocks up at the top, those universal tools and designated supports. You always want to refer back to the accessibility matrix because that one breaks it down by domain. So we also want to point out the fact that some of the accessibility resources that might be available as a designated support for one particular domain may be considered an accommodation for another domain. And the only way to find that out concretely is by referring to the California Accessibility Matrix. As the resource graph, it gives you a nice visual, but it doesn't give you all of the information you require. Now at the bottom section of our pictures right here, we see accommodations. So in accommodations, those are those accessibility supports that are available for students and require whether it be a Section 504 plan or an IEP. And these need to be documented. Again, the recommendation being made by a team and documented as to why that accommodation would be appropriate for the student and how it supports in the assessment. Because we want to make sure that when we are assessing, we are not assessing the disability, but the language proficiency relative to the domain that is being assessed. So considering every single one of those UDAs is important. Considering them individually, not just overall, domain by domain. If we already know that receptive language is an issue for a particular student based on the intersection of English language proficiency and disability, then I'm going to go straight away to those receptive language domains, which would be my listening and my reading, and I'm going to be sure to see what types of supports are available, not just under the U's, not just under the D's, but under the A's as well, since they do have, in fact, an active IEP, and take a look at to which supports would best align to meet the needs for our individual student. So, as a form of a checklist or a way to summarize what we just discussed about accessibility resources, these are some of these considerations that you want to keep in mind as you are making these determinations. You want to make sure that you've considered which accessibility resources have been applied to the SBAC and the ELPAC for administration by domain. Again, that accessibility resource matrix will tell you exactly which ones are available, so you can start considering which ones to apply. You'll also want to see which of these accessibility resources support the student's identified needs. If the student is a student who benefits from having text read aloud, you might want to consider, does the student respond better to a human reader or to text to speech? Because that does make a difference, doesn't it? Like, it's what they are exposed to in the classroom, what is better going to translate when it comes to the assessment. Checking that there is an opportunity for the student that if perhaps they're used to a human reader, yet you want to transition them into text to speech for assessment, or as you develop more skills and activities to develop independence as they grow older and progress through the school years, then you might want to start to consider embedding opportunities for them to access text to speech to determine which support would work best for the student. Will they still require a human reader, or will they require text to speech? An additional consideration for that would be what type of voice. Knowing that some of our students with distinct disabilities and whose disability manifests in certain ways is going to impact how we request, how we apply some of these resources. So for example, if a student responds better to text to speech from a female voice, there is an option for that as well. Or if we check back to the specifications within the ELPAC testing interface and only a male voice is available and the student has been using a female voice, providing opportunities for them to grow accustomed to that type of a male voice versus the female or vice versa is critical in allowing them to access that, because we don't want to enable accessibility resources that may act as a hindrance and not a support for the student. Additionally, on top of that, just as I mentioned right now with the text-to-speech, is provide ample opportunities for students to practice with the use of these accessibility resources. I always share this story of when I started out teaching, I would enable every single resource, just as the principal alluded to in the video, where you don't want to give just everybody text-to-speech, everybody this, everybody that. My goal was to support students the best way possible, so I thought the more the better, but oftentimes that got in the way into how the students were going to access their resources. So for example, one of the resources that I would turn up was masking, because my students would use physical masking in the classroom. They would use, whether it be a piece of construction paper, whether it be a bookmarker to cover sections. I taught them how to fold pages over. However, that didn't necessarily translate to digital masking. The concept I thought they got, you cover up what you're not using so as to not be distracted. However, the feature masking as it presented in the testing interface was that the student not only had to have the level of digital literacy to recognize the masking tool, but also the manual dexterity to be able to manipulate that mouse, to create that box, to drag it and cover those sections of text, to be able to then mask the content that wasn't going to be distracting to them. However, I skipped that step altogether. I was only doing physical masking in the classroom, didn't spend enough time teaching them how to digitally mask. And what ended up happening is that as I'm walking and observing screens, I'm seeing checkerboards, squares upon squares. And with no purpose. So it ended up being more of a distraction, as well-meaning as I might have been. And I considered that they do in fact benefit from masking, but it was physical masking. So those considerations in engaging in conversations for determining what types of accessibility resources are appropriate for students are critical, because it really does lead to those nuanced conversations that we oftentimes don't have, which takes into account the students' ability to practice in the classroom, whether it's helpful to the students, such as a step that we oftentimes skip also. Was this helpful to you? Is this being helpful to you in instruction? Might you use it in assessment? Engaging in those conversations with students to determine appropriateness is critical. What if you've exhausted everything? What if you exhausted all the universal tools, all the designated supports, and all of the accommodations? You've tried every combination there is and will be to support the student. And it just might be that, as this last bullet indicates, might a domain exemption be appropriate? And for that, it requires a different level of conversation from the IEP team, where we go back to disability category, because as I mentioned earlier, are we truly assessing English language proficiency, or are we assessing the disability? There might be a situation where a domain exemption is perfectly appropriate, and this discussion needs to be held in the context of the IEP team meeting and documented as such. To participate in those steps, there's a fantastic resource, which is the accessibility checklist. This California assessment accessibility checklist will help guide teams in their exploration of UDAs by domain, appropriateness of domain exemption, or perhaps the alternate assessment. So we're going to start by looking at this very first section of the student accessibility checklist. And this section is for students who are English learners, where we are considering universal tools, designated supports, and accommodations. Because it's important for us to have a structured conversation as to what the supports necessary for individual students might be and the impact of the disability in these different language domains, we want to have a structured means of guiding that conversation so that it can then be documented appropriately in the IEP. So when we look at this first box, we're looking at accessibility resources, and already it gives us a visual of the 4 domains and how each of those domains have a corresponding universal tools, designated supports, accommodations, and if necessary, unlisted resources. Unlisted resources are resources that are not included within the assessment matrix. However, you may request the use of them, and that is detailed within the assessment matrix. So if you refer back to the section under enlisted resources, it gives you a series of steps on how you may go about requesting unlisted resources. So as you can see, listening, speaking, reading, and writing all have corresponding UDAs as well as unlisted resources. The purpose is so that we can have a guided conversation on as far as to what accessibility resources are necessary. So for example, it might be possible that the student requires no accessibility resources in listening or speaking or reading. However, when it comes to writing, they might need a different level of support. Why? Because in their IEP and their present levels of performance, an academic area of need was identified for writing. They actually qualified for services under SLD specifically for writing. So that is the one area where you might want to go back to and start that conversation and perhaps work your way backwards, starting with the identified area of need. So again, this is a structured document that can help guide those conversations that are critical for students to access the assessment and to be able to demonstrate mastery from year to year or growth from year to year. So we know that a lot of these accessibility resources are scattered throughout, so we're always looking for ways to support practitioners out in the field. So what we've done is we've included this Padlet, which should be linked to our resource Padlet for today, and if not, maybe Debbie will be dropping it into the chat in a couple of minutes. So we have as many accessibility resources that we could find related to both the CASP and the ELPAC. We've also included resources for the CAA and for the ELTypology. So we'll keep adding to this Padlet. This Padlet will remain readily available to you, and just check back every so often to make sure that you have the latest version of the documents. If you still print out things like I do, the electronic versions are constantly changing as additions and edits are made to them. So make sure that you refer back to this section of the Padlet so that you can have access to all of these accessibility resources as they relate to both the CASP, the ELPAC, ELTypology, and California alternate assessment. Then as we move further down to this middle section of the accessibility checklist, now we come upon possible domain exemptions. So as mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that we exhaust all UDAs before considering a domain exemption. When we're looking at domain exemptions, we're looking at consideration because of the disability's impact on access or performance in a said domain. Now, critical to this step is the discussion that will take place in the IEP team. When you're having this discussion, it is very important to have an EL specialist, an EL TOSA, somebody who knows about language development, and the student's caseload manager, their special education service provider, speech and language, if they're receiving speech and language supports, to determine if a domain exemption is appropriate, as it will be or might appear that, let's say, the speaking domain would be measuring disability and not necessarily language proficiency. So if the disability precludes the student from accessing and demonstrating growth, mastery, access, just access altogether, then a domain exemption might be appropriate. And this checklist helps you have that conversation. We also want to remember that for an overall score to be generated, you can only exempt one domain per composite. So for example, if we refer back to our visual of the written language composite, which was reading and writing, you may only exempt one of those domains. If you exempt both, then you'll generate a loss score, which is the lowest obtainable scaled score, and you don't want to do that. So you can only exempt one domain per language composite. Critical to remember that as you are considering domain exemptions. So remembering, of course, that you want to review your accessibility resources and make sure that you've exhausted all of them before considering a domain exemption, and to document it as such in your IEP. So when we're looking at the domain exemptions, I'm going to give some more concrete examples, so more visual examples of that other page. So as I mentioned on the previous one, so an IEP team may consider the domain exemption where the domains is not accessible. So that's when the IEP then engages in this conversation. Knowing, of course, reminders that out of oral language and written language, only one domain can be exempted. So here in a more visual format, from oral language composite, it can either be the listening or the speaking, not both. If you are looking at the written language composite, either reading or writing, not both. So just key points to remember when considering ELPAC domain exemptions. Which finally brings us to alternate assessment. Hot topic, especially as we're moving from locally determined English language proficiency assessment to the ELPAC. So as we start considering the alternate ELPAC, the number one question first is, does the student have a significant cognitive disability? It all hinges on that. Okay, does the student have a significant cognitive disability? If the answer is no, then the ELPAC is not appropriate. If the answer is yes, then that kicks off another series of steps that the team will consider. And to take you a little bit more deeply into that, I'm going to hand it over to Debbie, and she's going to walk us through the California alternate ELPAC.
Thank you, everyone. We truly appreciate all of the questions in the chat box and in the Q&A segment. And I know there were several questions regarding students who may be nonverbal, students who have cognitive disabilities, students who have, again, multiple disabilities. And this is where we'll begin the conversation with alternate ELPAC and who may be eligible and those students who are not eligible for the alternate ELPAC. So as Vanessa explained the domain exemptions, we always want to first consider universal tools, designated supports, and accommodations. However, we do have a subgroup of students who we then turn to these confirmations to then determine as an IEP team, is the child eligible for the alternate ELPAC? So the alternate ELPAC will launch November 1st. I'll say that ahead of time because I know that's probably at the forefront of your mind is when. We still have some time and we'll go a little bit deeper into that segment now. So prior to assigning the alternate ELPAC for a student, we first want to have our IEP teams make these general IEP team confirmations. Only the IEP team can designate the appropriateness for a student to take the alternate ELPAC. So for an English learner who was dually identified as a student with a disability, we would first ask the IEP team to confirm, does the student have an impact, a significant impact to their cognitive functioning and adaptive behavior? So those two go hand in hand, not an and or, but and. So the student has significant impacts to cognitive functioning, intellectual functioning, and adaptive behavior. For our school psychologists out in the field, this sounds very familiar to you as the definition under the eligibility and IDEA for an intellectual disability. However, I want to preface that with saying that children with other disability categories may also be identified into this subgroup, as we have some, but not all, students who have a disability, primary disability of autism, where they may be students who have significant intellectual disabilities as well as adaptive behavioral needs. But as we know, within each of the disability categories, every child is unique. So every child with a disability under intellectual disability, specific learning disability, which I'm going to come back to because they are not eligible for this assessment. I'm going to come back to that though. But as we identify students, particularly in the disability category of autism, or children with multiple disabilities, regardless of the unique primary disability category for which that child is eligible for special education, these three questions need to be answered with a yes response before we can move forward and assign them any alternate assessment. So this is true also for assigning an alternate assessment to the SFAC, which is the CAA, or some call it the Cal-Alt. So as we look at the ELPAC, this is our first question. Does the student have significant impacts to their cognitive functioning and adaptive behavior? Some artifacts that you might be able to use is that psychoeducational report in combination perhaps with your speech and language assessment report as you look comprehensively at the needs of the student to guide your discussion and confirmation on this particular item. The next item, however, is regarding the students' supports that they receive in congruence with the California state standards. You'll see that we also have linked into this particular slide the CAA blueprint. So as you are also working with your students who have significant cognitive disabilities, you're able to also reference those standards that you are utilizing during everyday instruction. And that would then again assist and support you as you understand what does progress look like for our students. We often refer to our students with significant cognitive disabilities as those students with extensive support needs. So I'll often use those terms interchangeably also. So as we consider the needs of students with extensive support needs who have significant cognitive disabilities, we understand that they do receive alternate supplemental curriculum and supports, that they also receive extensive supports from staff and personnel to modify and adapt their curriculum. For students in this range, again, we are looking at their present levels of performance and functional academic skills. So as we consider students with significant cognitive disabilities and adaptive behavioral needs, identifying that they are using content that is aligned to standards, but then lastly, also confirming that they are students who require substantial supports. I often get a question there, if I'll read it to you, where it says number 3. The IEP team confirms that the student is or will be receiving extensive, direct, individualized instruction. That's not to be confused with do they have an individual assistant? That's not what this question is asking. They may. However, this is asking, does the student receive curriculum, differentiation, support, explicit direct instruction at a level unique for that student, that there are ample modifications and adaptations for that child to truly have access to curriculum and instruction, and therefore need that equal amount of access and support to be able to be administered an assessment. Because as we noted before in the examples that Vanessa gave, there are circumstances where the ELPAC in and of itself, given universal supports, designated tools, and accommodations, the test in and of itself is not accessible, even with domain exemptions. And for this reason, because the student has a significant cognitive disability, the ELPAC in and of itself would not be assessing their needs or their English language acquisition skills. In actuality, it would be assessing their disability and directly affect their performance, perhaps their frustration, and their ability to be assessed in its entirety. So these are the three main confirmations that your IEP teams will have in discussion. If you're using the ELPAC accessibility checklist, it is that bottom section regarding the alternate assessments. In addition, there is a separate document, and those of you who most vendors for your IEP systems have also adopted the form, which is regarding the alternate assessments, which includes these main three questions. So as we discuss IEP team guidance, because as I mentioned before, only the IEP team can make these determinations together and identify the appropriateness of taking an alternate assessment, CDE has confirmed that unfortunately, in the past, there have been a subgroup of students who have been inappropriately assigned to take alternate assessments. And that specifically pertains to this disability category, which is specific learning disability. Students who are identified in this particular category are not eligible and should not be considered for alternate assessments, as students in this disability category are not students who have significant impacts to cognition. There may be some adaptive behavioral needs, but again, we want to ensure that students who take alternate assessments are identified appropriately as students who have significant cognitive disabilities and adaptive behavioral needs. So again, to note, you may need to amend IEPs, have discussion in IEPs, because as we have examples that come from the field, for instance, frequently we do receive questions regarding students whom are potentially nonverbal, or students who are deaf or hard of hearing. We first, of course, want to consider accommodations, the use of augmentative alternative communication devices, or AC. We want to ensure that they are receiving the supports to have access to the assessment that is most appropriate for them, and aligning the right student profile to the right test. It's not to say that we're giving an easier test in the alternates versus the standard SBAC or ELPAC, but we're really looking at what are the needs of the student. Have we ensured that all the accessibility measures are there for the student? But again, should the student have a significant cognitive disability and adaptive behavioral needs, require extensive supports and modifications, then they would be eligible for the alternate ELPAC. So the alternate ELPAC field test, again, will go operational and live November 1st. It does meet the requirements for the summative. So if you were a school site, district, COE, or SELPA administering a locally determined alternate assessment for the summative, you will now all switch over to the alternate ELPAC. So locally determined alternate assessments have now been retired, with the exception for the use of an initial. So as we discussed earlier, the initial ELPAC, as students enroll, and upon their enrollment into a U.S. school, in 30 days from that enrollment, they will take an initial ELPAC. For students who are already identified as a student with significant cognitive disabilities and adaptive behavioral needs, they could take the initial locally determined alternate assessment. So the alternate assessment, again, for summative purposes, is built on these communication modes. And I want to say communication mode specifically to highlight, and I'll come back to this. Please keep in mind the form, the preference of modality of the students whom you serve. So if you are a teacher or an administrator of a program, as I was, for students with significant cognitive disabilities who utilize AAC throughout their day, that is their preferred mode of communication. If you serve students who are at the object level, picture level, again, whether the degree of prompts that you use, again, all of that will be taken into consideration so that students are assessed appropriately given the alternate ELPAC. So the communication modes that you'll see on the alternate ELPAC, though yes, listening, speaking, reading, and writing are included, they are included in an integrated manner where you'll see receptive items and expressive items. You'll see the items throughout the assessment where students, again, are assessed in their preferred communication modality to best meet their needs. This is exciting for us in the field to see this assessment go operational, again, in hopes to ensure that students whom are English learners with disabilities have equal access to an assessment that's appropriate and that's aligned to the California ELD standards. So having that alignment then will bring us data, will glean greater information on how to best serve our students, how to shape instruction for our students. But again, most importantly, as we start in this journey towards the alternate ELPAC, is considering what are your students' preferred mode of communication. So if you are a teacher, administrator, again, COE, SELPA, county office, LEA level, considering again, what is the mode of communication most appropriate for your student? We will want to respect that level of communication and utilize that modality of communication. For this particular reason, unlike the ELPAC, the alternate ELPAC will be administered by the student's teacher, the person who most knows and understands the student's modality of communication and who is able to fully understand, allow accessibility, and support the student at their level of need. So here I just have some images that students use within our programs. You'll see the picture of a student who has a mounted switch onto his wheelchair. We have students who use a one switch, maybe a three talker, or a dynamic display. Also know through the alternate ELPAC, if you have students at the object permanence level, you can utilize objects. You can download the assessment. You can have all the test items ready and available so you can pre-program all of your AAC, your switches, and have everything ready to go prior to administration. So I think that's one of the true beauty and virtues of this assessment is that it is starting from the onset to align with the needs of our students with the most needs. So again, keep in mind as you prepare for the launch of this assessment. So when does it launch and some important dates to remember? November 1st through February 15th. So you have a rather large window, which is needed and necessary because this is an individually administered assessment. So as we consider the needs of our students with extensive support needs, they will be assessed individually by their teacher, whom has the greatest knowledge of the student and their preferred mode of communication. So you'll have that field test window to assess all of your English learners. Standard setting would then follow, and then reporting and release of those reporting and scores. So more information to come regarding the standard setting and the score reports. But at this point, our true focus is to ensure that our assessors, our teachers, test examiners, if you will, are ready and prepared to assess our students who are eligible for the alternate ELPAC. The alternate ELPAC in itself aligns to the ELD standards. This is something that, again, is so important to the field as we work together and in conjunction to build common language between special educators, EL coordinators, and specialists in alignment and leveraging, again, our support to each other as practitioners in the field and, of course, to our students so they can truly have access to the English language development standards in a way that is appropriate for our students with the most needs and disabilities. So as we look at the ELD connectors, they are linked into this slide. The alternate ELPAC blueprint is the title of the document. And there are the ELD connectors which list out the general education, if you will, ELD connectors, which are prioritized and then connected, you'll see are some ELD connectors, following much the format like the California Alternate Assessments Blueprint, which also have the Common Core State Standards, the connectors, and then the essential understandings. So let's take a look. In the chat box, we'll go ahead and drop in this document, which is the Alternate English Language Proficiency Assessments Blueprint. It is in your Padlet as well, and it is linked into your presentation slides. So if you notice in the table of contents, you'll see there that you will find either your grade level or your grade span if you are a teacher or service provider. For our administrators at the K-6 level, junior high level, high school level, maybe you're a unified school district, you'll note there the grades and grade spans. So it'll be important to identify again which are the ELD connectors that uniquely resonate not only to you in your practice, but as a support provider where you may be a trainer, a coach, an EL specialist, where then you will be utilizing the ELD connectors to assist and support your special educators in the inclusion of the ELD standards by way of the ELD connectors. This will also shape how integrated and designated ELD looks like and how it is utilized to support our English learners with the most extensive support needs. So let's take a deeper dive into the ELPAC connectors. The ELPAC connectors, again, are the ELD standards are listed first. So the ELD in the far column. The ELD standards exactly as it exists in the ELD standards blueprint that's out since 2012 that we've been utilizing. And special educators uniquely, it has been a little bit difficult to then apply. What does this look like in the classroom, especially for my students with most extensive support needs? How do I scaffold? What does trellising look like for these ELD standards for our students? That's where the ELD connectors column. So I have to say thank you to all the practitioners in the field who have worked with ETS, the Sacramento County Office of Ed, with CDE, who have worked together to bring these ELD connectors in a way that are meaningful, adapted, and pre-accommodated, if you will, to better support the needs of students with extensive support needs. So as we consider our students who are dually identified English learners with disabilities, we'll see there the difference of what the general education ELD looks like and then how it can be adapted for our students with the most unique needs. Because as we mentioned before, the ELD standards are core for all ELs, as all English learners are general education students first. In special education, we then layer on supports onto that. And it has been a rather stretch from ELD standard to adaptations for our students, especially our students with most extensive needs. So you'll see here in that very first example, it's an exchange. For special educators, I know our mind automatically goes to an exchange with perhaps the use of our communication device, maybe our students' use of a picture schedule, a picture exchange, maybe it's I still say old-fashioned communication wallet, our communication binders when technology is not working. And that exchange looks different for our students with disabilities. And this particular ELD connector, which you'll see in the middle column there, you'll see that it goes from complex oral conversations to a short exchange. You'll also see that it goes from a range of social and academic topics to the ELD connector that is very clear that it says expressing one's own ideas about familiar social and academic topics. So it gives us an entry point that perhaps is more relevant, if you will, or accessible to us as educators as we want to ensure fidelity to the ELD standards, want to continue alignment with grade level, and want to ensure that students have access to the ELD standards. So your mind might be going a little further and forward to linguistically appropriate goals and objectives. And although that's not today's session, we will come back to these ELD connectors as we delve into our next session when we discuss linguistically appropriate goals and objectives, as we align again to the ELD standards. So I'm going to give you a moment in just a second to explore the ELD blueprint yourself. So although again it's labeled as alternate assessment, English language proficiency assessments, blueprint, yes, the blueprint is there for the alternate ELPAC, but we want to focus you in on the ELD connectors today as we start again at that base of what designated and integrated can look like for our students with extensive support needs. So as you explore the ELD connectors, you'll find your grade level or grade span. Perhaps you're an administrator, EL coach, EL specialist, and you might want to peruse all the different grades or just select one that you know that you want to get started into that grade level or grade span. As you find that grade span, especially for our test examiners, our teachers and service providers, consider the preferred mode of communication. Also consider the linguistic support needs that the child may need, primary language supports that the child may need to acquire, to have access to, again, to fully access the ELD connectors. Because as Vanessa reviewed, mild supports, linguistic supports, whether mild, again, to more moderate, depending on the needs of the student. So in our frame of reference, as we consider the needs of students with extensive support needs, we're looking at their level of English language proficiency, what primary language resources and supports they may need, as well as their preferred mode of communication as another layer onto that to ensure access. So as you delve into the ELD connectors, you will have a Jamboard. You'll click on the link to the Jamboard, make a copy of that Jamboard. By doing so, the Jamboard will be yours to keep. You can then utilize it at your respective school sites, with your grade level team, at your district, COE, SELPA, as you see appropriate. So first, click on the link to the Jamboard. Within it contained, you will find, again, the ELD connectors. Find your grade level and grade span and explore. Solely exploration, keeping these themes in mind as you, again, make connections to how you will utilize these ELD connectors within your own practice to best serve students with disabilities. So you'll have about 10 minutes to get in, explore the ELD connectors. We'll be watching the chat, but again, right now, pure exploration of the ELD connectors to build your familiarity with them. Thank you. Okay. So as you had an opportunity to explore the ELD connectors and utilize them, perhaps you were looking again at your grade level, or maybe you are a teacher or support provider to a grade level span, where you then reflected on that grade level span and what it looked like from ELD standard to that connector to that standard. You may have also noticed the numbering, and it's reference to the parts of the ELD standard. So part 1, for instance, in this example, and that ELD connector. On the far end, you would also have noticed the communication mode. So is this particular standard, and by way of the assessment, assessing receptive skills or expressive skills? As we noted before, we may have students who have challenges with expressive skills due to their disability, for which, again, we're considering their primary mode of communication and ensuring they have access to any AAC as necessary, ASL, and again, considerations for what those needs may be in preparation prior to the use of the assessment, and of course, integrated into everyday instruction. So inasmuch as we speak about the assessment, the alternate ELPAC and the ELPAC, what we really want your takeaway to be is the importance of the ELD standards and their consistent use as a basic service to all English learners, to ensure that the ELD standards are accessible to all English learners, again, in and throughout the classroom, whether you are the provider of integrated or designated ELD, as some teachers may uniquely have focused time, and that is their role, is providing designated ELD. Many of you, especially our special education teachers who serve students with extensive support needs, you are entrusted to ensure that integrated and designated ELD is occurring for your students with extensive support needs. So at this time, as you were considering, again, what this will look like in your practice if you haven't already seen the ELD connectors, and maybe that you're going to share with friends, additional friends, so that they too can implement the ELD connectors, and that they too can consider and begin utilizing them already for linguistically appropriate goals and objectives if they haven't begun to do so already. So as we consider the ELD standards and the ELD connectors, we want to ensure that we build relationships both with our EL specialists, our special educators, to include service providers. There was a wonderful question in the Q&A box from, I think it was an SLP, who said, well, I haven't necessarily been included in these conversations. As an IEP team member, especially our SLPs who are worth their weight in gold, again, who understand language development, who understand the natural progression of language, seated together with an EL specialist who understands second language acquisition skills, together with a special educator, we can definitely sit together, plan, and ensure that students have access to the appropriate mode of communication and to ensure that assessments and tools are accessible for students. So this might be that opportunity that as you consider the alternate ELPAC, maybe this is a student who is approaching and at the next level of utilization of a different form of AAC. Maybe they're going from that 3-talker to 4 cells to dynamic display, depending on where your student is. We want to again revert to the preferred mode of communication, because just as with the ELPAC, we don't want to turn on any unnecessary tools for our students with extensive support needs. We don't want to introduce them to a brand new tool, brand new AAC device at the moment of assessment, if that makes sense. But we want to ensure, again, consistency during instruction as during assessment and statewide assessment. So at this point in time, we wanted to give you a stop and pause to be able to share with us a new learning and or a wondering. And I'd love to hear your wonderings, whether it's about the alternate ELPAC, the ELD connectors, the initial ELPAC, or anything that we've covered this morning. For select questions, my colleague Vanessa is actually going to read your question out loud, and I will do my best to answer it live because I want to ensure that you are all engaged. I know you have questions. So if you don't mind dropping a new learning and a wondering into the Q&A box or the chat box. The Q&A is easier because we can ensure that we've answered it live if you would like for us to read your question aloud. Or feel free to use the chat box, as there may be some wondering circling as we have covered much material since this morning. So I'll stop and see if there are any wonderings. Of course, to our live audience, thank you for being here live. It's nice to just have a little bit of moral support. Are there any questions maybe from our live audience? Every wondering is a good wondering. I know that when everyone was kind of like, ooh, I have lots of wonderings. And that's okay.
So we have a couple that have popped up in the Q&A section.
Okay.
One coming regarding a student who is deaf, and the parent indicated Spanish as the family's primary language. How does a practitioner address that in relation to ELPAC assessment or alternate ELPAC assessment if appropriate?
So I think I'd have some additional questions, but what I can say is as we're considering the needs of students who are deaf or hard of hearing, we also want to acknowledge again, maybe the student has some residual hearing. Is there ASL in the home? Is the student fully aided, cochlear? What are the conditions of the student as far as accessibility? Because although the student, him or herself, may be deaf, nonverbal, they have been receptive to language in the home. And that goes true the same for students who, because of symptoms or related to their autism, they may be nonverbal, fully, no significant cognitive impacts, and we're considering the ELPAC administration, but we want to ensure that they are accommodated for. So the student, in fact, is still an English learner because they have been receptive in receiving instruction, commands, supports, from infancy in their primary language, which was other than English. So that's where those home language survey questions come into play was, has any other language than English been utilized with the child, again, during their progression, during their learning and their development? So as we're considering, as we've also seen on home language surveys, because I think mine was probably like that as a child, where the parent puts English/Spanish. or they put English/Espanol. And that's okay, but we know that the child is in a bilingual household, has been receiving information and comprehending and understanding. As we know, our students may have much more developed receptive skills than they do have expressive skills. So taking that into consideration is very important as well. Next question.
Have one that's a reflection and also a question. So new learning, SLI, speech and language, students who qualify under this category do not take the ELTypology. Is that correct? Or does it depend?
I think it would depend. So that was a great question. So a student has, I'm going to assume it's a secondary disability if we're considering the alternate assessment. So if, again, when in doubt, go back to those essential confirmations. So those 3 IEP team confirmations, and the first being, regardless of primary or secondary disability category, our question is, does the student have significant cognitive disabilities, so significant impacts to cognition and adaptive behavior? That's our number 1 question. We would not really move on to the other questions if that first question is a no. So regardless of the primary disability category, SLI, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, that is our number 1 question. Does the student have a significant cognitive impact or delay and adaptive behavior? So that is our number 1 question.
Follow-up with that would be, so is the main purpose of the ELD connectors to provide a guide to the specific supports to the student according to their need?
So the ELD connectors have multiple functions, which is wonderful. So you'll see them there. Equity and accessibility is the first thing that I think about when I think about the ELD connector. Because prior to that ELD connector, the ELD standard in and of itself was difficult to say that our students were approaching. Our responsibility in special education is to ensure that our students with disabilities have access to grade level content and standards, that they are approaching and have access. So although they may not be working at grade level, they have access to those grade level standards. And here, by way of the ELD connectors, we have an alignment not only to the grade level for the ELD standard, but a connector with the embedded scaffolds, adaptations, and modifications to best be able to present and utilize those ELD connectors during everyday instruction, whether during, or not whether, but all-encompassing during integrated and designated ELD. So it's really the application that the ELD connector provides us with. What it also does for us is, since it has that built-in scaffold, we're able to further chunk out that ELD connector to show us the entry point of where we can get started in supporting our English learners to develop English language acquisition skills, to shape their instruction to support their needs. So as we utilize primary language in many instances to bridge into, because again, it is an asset, a skill that we can help students bridge into a new language, the ELD connector provides us with more clarity as we support students with disabilities to approach, engage, and utilize the ELD standards as they develop their productive communication skills, collaborative communication skills, integration, again, of utilizing literacy, writing, speaking, reading. So as we consider those ELD connectors, again, it's one step closer for our students to have, again, that access and equity that they're entitled to as core for all English learners, including English learners with disabilities, includes comprehensive ELD, both designated and integrated. Is there another question?
We have another one that's more of a scenario.
Ooh, okay.
It's about an RSP student whose disability affects both in reading and writing abilities significantly. He doesn't qualify for the alternate ELPAC, but cannot pass the reading and writing ELPAC tests, even though he is speaking in English. We have already exempted him from reading. What else can be done to support him? He seems to be stuck in ELD and falling through the cracks by not scoring high enough to pass the ELPAC, but not low enough to qualify for the alternate.
Okay, so I think what I also heard is that the student has already taken a domain exemption or is being considered already. So let's consider the accessibility checklist. And I come back to the accessibility checklist because it gives us a form of reference to indicate and observe. I'd also be very curious about the student's IEP. So we'd want to start with the IEP and fully look at the student's disability. What is that student's primary disability category, and how does it truly impact, substantially, adversely impact that student's learning? So as we consider, maybe it's coming to bring back the multidisciplinary team through the IEP to discuss not only what are the student's goals, but again, what is that student's primary disability and what are the impacts? And it makes me think automatically of the student who we want to identify what is their processing disorder if their primary disability is specific learning disability. How does that particular primary processing disorder affect the student's learning, their ability to demonstrate and show what they know, and also to receptively gather information through the instructional process? Because that brings us back to, what does ELD truly look like for that student? After the break today, we are going to discuss Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. But as we consider the needs of students, because I've heard many scenarios where the student may have a mild disability, such as a specific learning disability, there are no impacts or delays, I should say, in cognition, but yet their processing disorder is so impacting that the student has struggled. And we've heard the term before, our ELTels, students who, again, may not be showing the progress that we would hope for. So we'd first want to start with, what does utilization of the ELD standards look like? How have they been differentiated, and how have we provided accommodations to the student? When we consider, as Vanessa reviewed, the universal tools, designated tools, and accommodations, because the student does already have an IEP, the IEP team may need to revisit what those accommodations are and what they look like, and have those accommodations been utilized consistently during instruction and then application during the actual assessment. So we'd want to go forward and review that. As we note that the ELPAC is often administered by someone other than the student's teacher, we'd also want to go back and perhaps talk to who was the assessor, our EL specialist, our EL coach, maybe even our test site coordinator, to ensure that in fact all the accommodations were turned on and utilized by the student. So not only accessible on, but utilized by the student. And what did that look like? So during the next ELPAC administration, you may want to sit in and observe and ensure that the student has been provided those accommodations. When we consider the domain exemptions, as noted before, we want to uniquely ensure that the student's disability, how their disability impedes learning, is taken into consideration. Is that a unique feature of that disability for which the student is also receiving special education supports and services? A good clue is, does the student also have a goal in that respective area? But in and of itself, having those three dots linked through doesn't always mean that the student requires a domain exemption. It's more about ensuring accessibility. If the team has already considered a domain exemption, you may want to look deeper into saying, what were the other scores? What does the student score profile look like for that student's age and grade level? As we consider that student score profile, we want to identify what other areas were deficit. Do we have any blaring accounts, or are they all in the same profile? If they're all in the same range, I probably would want to go back to asking, what does ELD instruction look like for this particular student? Then I'd also want to consider, what is the domain exemption that we've already indicated? Perhaps in few occasions, there may be an additional domain exemption, as you may domain exempt one from the oral language composite, and you may exempt one domain from the written language composite. Again, no more than one in each, or you will develop a lost score. And without data, again, we're not able to fully inform ourselves and further shape instruction. So I know that was a long question, but I would again suggest starting with, what does ELD look like, ensuring appropriate accommodations during the administration of the ELPAC. And again, you just administered the summative in the spring, and now for our folks, yes, you will administer one more time as the alternate ELPAC has moved to the fall/spring. So that's a frequently asked question. I was surprised wasn't in the box as we were considering, because the window for the alternate ELPAC does begin November 1st. You may be thinking, well, I just administered our locally determined alternate assessment this spring. But again, we will be assessing our students with extensive support needs beginning on November 1st. So the alternate ELPAC, again, will be accessible. The ELD connectors are accessible to you. Any other new learnings or wonderings anyone would like to share before we head you off to lunch?
So there is one more.
Okay.
And this one is, again, more of a scenario, and it's about a new student who does not speak English, does not use Braille, and is sight impaired. They're not really sure how to test with the initial ELPAC. He is newly enrolled from a Spanish-speaking country, so indication that
Newcomer.
yes,
But
newcomer,
we do know visual
primary
impairments.
language different, visual impairment.
Okay. So the student may be in the initial phases of learning Braille. We'd want to get some information, and I'm hoping that someone at your school site is fluent in the family's primary language. And I would be remiss to say you are all so amazing in California, because you may be in a district where multiple languages and dialects within languages are represented, so it may become challenging. So first step, we'd want to know as much as we can gather from the family, and having some interviews and building some rapport with the family and engaging them to better understand the student's learning, the student's mode of communication in primary language. Because as the child may not have developed Braille just yet, they may, again, given the information that you have, you may need to enlist a translator to translate any documents. You may have a wealth of medical records at your disposal, perhaps. But again, a parent interview would be definitely a good start to find out, again, more information regarding the depth of the visual impairment, how we might provide access to the particular student, because the student, again, may not have a cognitive disability, but does need some supports due to the visual impairment. You may also want to consider the development of an IEP if you haven't already done so. Hope you have, or a 504 plan. Perhaps a 504 plan is sufficient, again, given the needs of the student. That's where more understanding and involvement from the family, parents, guardians, to better understand what learning looks like for the student. How does the student currently communicate in his or her environment outside of the school, in their previous school, if outside of the US, what artifacts may be available for us to utilize to better understand where the student is in the progression of their learning, regardless of English language proficiency, but all of the skills and abilities that the student brings with him or her as a student, as an individual. So we can then build accommodations and, again, engage in that IEP conversation or 504 plan conversation about the potential need for a domain exemption, because domain exemptions are also available to students on a 504. So that might be your starting point, is, again, lots of information gathering to ensure accessibility, because regardless, student does need to be assessed with an initial, whether, again, if with domain exemptions, accommodations, and the latter. So again, lots of information gathering. Okay, I don't think there are any other questions. It is exactly 11:30. So we are going to break at this time for a 1-hour lunch. So you have 60 minutes to take a break, regroup. Do know that if you log out, you can always log back in. If you want to leave your Zoom just running, leave your Zoom running. I also encourage you to drop any wonderings into the Q&A or into the chat box, whichever you feel most comfortable with. When we regroup after lunch, we will address any of the questions. Vanessa and I will be reading the questions during the break. We'll answer them, or we'll answer them live when we get back from the break. When we come back, we're going to also look at a scenario of a student who is nonverbal, a child who has a primary disability of autism, so that you can, again, look in a practical stance at some of the terms that we've shared and information. So again, enjoy your lunch. In 1 hour at 12:30, we'll start right back up. Thank you so much. And again, thank you for joining, and we hope to see you for the second half of our session. Opportunity again to say a huge thank you. Vanessa and I here, your presenters today, having the great opportunity to share the information, to share all of the information from the California Practitioner's Guide. Again, this could not be possible without the support from the California Department of Education, The California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, CDE and CCE, have been instrumental in supporting this work through the SELPA Content Lead Grant. I also have to say thank you to our Imperial County Office of Education, our Superintendent, Dr. Todd Fennell, as well as our Deputy Superintendent, Amanda Brooke, who has also been a supportive and instrumental in their support to us to be able to share this information with you, aside from the regular work that we do here at Imperial County SELPA. So please do visit our website when you have a chance, in addition to all of the resources that we shared, just in case. Remake that Padlet, keep it, save it for your own, or visit our website where every single resource is uploaded to our website at www.icoe.org/SELPA. So please do visit our website. During the course of the lunch session, there were a few questions, and I'll touch upon those as we recap and we come back from lunch. Hopefully you had a good lunch and you're well rested and collected. And if you had a wondering, pop up, a question during your break, feel free to drop it in the chat or the Q&A. Vanessa's monitoring both right now as I speak to ensure that we have answered your questions. We don't want you to leave with too many wonderings out there for this session. So, as noted before, comprehensive ELD. So let's start there, as we took an opportunity to dive in and explore the ELD connectors. So the ELD standards, now the companion, the ELD connectors, to ensure that English learners with extensive support needs are receiving access and equity to curriculum and instruction, that they receive comprehensive ELD, both integrated and designated ELD. As noted before, integrated ELD occurs in tandem with your California Common Core standards, as students are receiving primary language resources throughout their day as English learners, with and without disabilities. As English learners, they are participating in core subject matter and social situations and extracurriculars as English learners, and do need and require some primary language supports many times to be successful, to be able to engage in collaborative and productive ways. So as we consider integrated ELD, the next layer in comprehensive ELD is designated ELD, that protected time where students are receiving instruction and support, where ELD standards are kept at the forefront of learning. They shape and drive instruction. During designated ELD, for special education teachers, as you saw today, the ELD connectors are there to support you in this work if in fact the student is receiving designated ELD in a special education setting. So having said that, you may be considering and thinking the implications regarding least restrictive environment. As special educators, as multidisciplinary teams, I should say, we have the responsibility to engage our IEP team as a multidisciplinary team, which includes our general education staff, as well as our special education staff, your EL specialist or EL coordinator, maybe it's an EL teacher on special assignment, our speech and language pathologists who also have insight regarding language development. So as we consider our full team of special educators, as we make decisions about where is it most appropriate for the English learner to receive designated ELD? Is it the general education setting with like English learners at that level of English language acquisition? Or does the student have extensive support needs where designated ELD is best served in the special education setting? So as you consider those processes through the IEP team, let's come to a quick poll. So although today we are participating via webinar, please be brave. Enter into the chat box your thoughts. Polling questions here you can answer out loud with our in-person friends. So can a special education teacher provide English language development services for English learners in his or her classroom on his or her caseload? So can a special education teacher provide designated ELD for students with disabilities? Enter your response in the chat box. Don't be shy. Give it a minute or so. And the answer is yes. Special educators, by way of their credential, are able to provide English language development to students with disabilities. If you see there, the Ed code information is also listed in the FAQs. You'll see that link that says Chapter 1 FAQs. If you were to select that link, it will take you to a list of FAQs that are part of Chapter 1. So if you see there in the definition, it's not a requirement that the special education teacher or case manager provide ELD instruction unless the IEP states so, but ELD is a federal requirement. So again, let's unpack it just a little bit. So what does that mean? Again, all students are general education students first. English learners being general education students first. All English learners are entitled to and require to receive designated ELD and integrated ELD, which we term as comprehensive ELD. A student with a disability who is an English learner receives special education supports and services on top of those basic course services. So students or English learners with disabilities continue to retain those basic course services of comprehensive ELD. So dependent on the needs of the student, again, that multidisciplinary IEP team comes together and has a responsibility. We are entrusted as IEP team members to discuss how students are having access to the maximum extent appropriate to their non-disabled peers in general education environments. So as we consider the needs of English learners with disabilities, our dually identified students may well be served in a general education environment with accommodations, universal supports, and designated supports in a general education designated ELD section based on their unique level of English language acquisition and proficiency. So again, things to consider. And at this point, you may be reflecting on what are your current practices? What does designated and integrated ELD look like for the English learners with disabilities whom you serve? And at the varying grade levels within your district, your school site, maybe your COE as you support several districts, and your SELPA as you support several LEAs, special educators, and EL specialists alike. So things to consider as you're determining the needs through the IEP team of students with disabilities. But of course, I can't leave you without more resources. So there is an infographic. You can also find it in the Padlet. It is linked into this slide deck, and it can also be found at our ICOE Imperial County SELPA website, which is the 2021 alternate ELPAC task types, because I know many of you have many wonderings still about the alternate ELPAC and had questions about its administration, what does that look like, and again, wonderings about who is eligible and how was that test developed and designed. The alternate ELPAC infographic that you see here is a resource where you can explore the task types. There are embedded links that will take you again to the ELD connectors, to the ELPAC website, to the alternate ELPAC accessibility blueprint, and to again help shape and inform. Most importantly though, the Moodle website is linked into this infographic. The Moodle website will be the first step as you seek to train your test administrators, which are the special education teachers who know and understand your students with extensive support needs and their preferred mode of communication. So they, again, will go through that Moodle site and receive their certification and training for administration of the fall alternate ELPAC. So keep that resource handy. Again, feel free to drop any questions in the chat box. But let's help you put it all together. We've done a lot of conversing about Chapter 1, about the different artifacts and resources that are embedded in Chapter 1. But as every chapter in the California Practitioner's Guide comes to a summation, there is a student scenario. These student scenarios are very valuable to help you better understand in practical matters. What does it look like for a student? And although they're not exhaustive, they're very helpful as teams come together and discuss the different scenarios, just as many of you shared with us in the chat box. So in this student scenario, you have a student by the name of Javier, and Javier is a student with autism. Javier is also a student who is nonverbal. So we're going to give you a few minutes. I think we said maybe about 5. We'll give you a little bit more perhaps to delve into the student scenario of Javier. Hopefully it'll help piece together everything that we covered in the morning. And if you did come in late, this is a great way to catch you up to where we are now. Student scenario, again, of Javier. Go ahead and click on the link. It'll open up the student scenario, read through the scenario, and I want you to consider things that you notice and things that you are still wondering. And we'd love to see all those wonderings in the chat box, again, as you meet Javier through the student scenario. Thank you. So as you wrap up your reading of Javier in that student scenario, you may have had some additional wonderings, and I'd love to see them in the chat box. But just to recap a little bit. In this particular scenario, we have a student named Javier who is a child with a primary disability of autism. And as we know, every student within any unique disability category is an individual. So as we consider the needs of students with autism, we also recognize that every child is an individual with relative strengths and relative weaknesses. So having said that, Javier is a student with autism who is also nonverbal. As noted earlier, is that a child, given their primary disability, whether or not they're verbal or nonverbal, a student who uses alternative augmentative communication devices and supports, if we are considering their participation in an alternate ELPAC, our primary question is, does the student have a significant cognitive impairment and adaptive behavioral needs? That is our question. If we can answer yes, then we can consider the alternate ELPAC. But as you see in the case of Javier, Javier is a student who has a primary disability of autism and who is a child who is nonverbal. However, he has no cognitive delays. And for that reason, he and his IEP team have determined that the ELPAC is most appropriate for Javier. So as IEP teams come into these scenarios and you discuss the unique needs of the student, it is to discuss the individual unique, the I in the IEP, to develop the IEP surrounding the needs of the student specifically and determining what supports, universal, designated, and accommodations are necessary. And then determining perhaps and potentially should we have exhausted accommodations and find that the assessments continue to not be accessible, that we would consider domain exemptions where necessary, the few and far between. And then for those students who do have significant cognitive disabilities and adaptive behavioral needs, that the IEP team may consider the use of the alternate ELPAC. So in this scenario with Javier, we see that adjustments are being made, that the team is actively discussing his needs, and he's, again, in kindergarten. So from year to year, they may see Javier's IEP making adjustments to those accommodations, adding accommodations, perhaps changing and removing accommodations, again, as seen appropriate for Javier, his development, and his needs as it results from his unique disability. So again, if you have any questions, drop them into the chat box and or the Q&A. And I think there's a question.
Yes, we have a couple of questions that came up. The first one being, they're wondering if a child like Javier could have been offered the alternate ELPAC and how to determine whether or not he has severe cognitive delays. Like, how does one go about determining that?
That's a great question. So the IEP team in this scenario, although maybe, again, we're still reading between the lines, but your first question would be to ask, yes, what is the child's primary disability? And refer to that psychoeducational assessment report. Have an active conversation with your school psychologist. Have a conversation with the special education teacher so that we have a better understanding of how that student's disability impedes his or her learning. That way we have a better understanding, again, is there truly a significant cognitive disability? I know it can become easy to say this primary disability or this primary disability, but it's really about how that disability impacts or impedes that child's cognition and adaptive behavioral needs. So you definitely want to start with that psychoeducational assessment report and have a conversation with your school psychologist and assisting you if you yourself are not a school psychologist and able to interpret those assessment results.
I have a couple of wonderings related to designated ELD. So if the student is receiving designated ELD in a SPED setting, do we need to document that somewhere? Where does that get indicated?
Okay, That's a very good question. Thank you for that question. And it does come up about our students with extensive support needs, who their IEP already covers all of the instructional minutes potentially, because again, the student has significant needs, and for that reason is provided supports and services throughout their school day. If that is the case, which I'm kind of reading into that question, is that this may be a student who again receives all instructional supports and services because of extensive support needs. So their designated ELD is provided in the special education setting. So you wouldn't have a separate entry for a service code because your SAI is already accounted for. However, it is a responsibility of the teacher, of the school site, the administration to support the teacher, the EL specialist to support the teacher in ensuring that there's a designated protected time in the day where the ELD standards, or in this case, the ELD connectors, take forefront. So they are driving instruction for students who are English learners during that protected time to focus on the ELD standards. In that particular scenario, and I don't know which vendor you use, I can only speak for my own SELPA where we do use SACE. And on the special factors page, there is where you designate it and indicate how primary language supports and resources are provided during integrated ELD, as well as where designated ELD is provided. So it's very explicit now. You may have noticed that change in the IEP forms in the last few months, where it does ask, where is designated ELD provided? And you would indicate general education, or in this case, special education. If you're using a Cyrus, they also have a specific page specifically asking where is designated ELD provided.
And then we have a question regarding Javier. So did the team decide to give the ELPAC or the alternate ELPAC?
So they did discuss the ELPAC with accommodations, domain exemptions, and again, I think that's where the clarity still was to be found about, does the student have a significant cognitive disability? I also want to share, though, that the scenarios and some of the references in the California Practitioner's Guide, so thank you for that question, were pre-development of the alternate ELPAC. So you will see references in the California Practitioner's Guide to the locally determined alternate, and some of the scenarios also refer to alternate versus ELPAC. So again, be a little bit cognizant of that, but if you stay true to the 3 IEP team confirmations, which is, does the student have a significant cognitive disability and adaptive behavioral needs? Is the student receiving instruction based on California Common Core standards with ample supports and modifications? And is the student receiving extensive supports and services? So if you cover yes to all 3 of those questions, you could proceed with the ELPAC.
And related to that, didn't necessarily pop up right now, but it did come up earlier, is how often would you review appropriateness of alternate, domain exemption, accommodations? Is it in line with the plan review? How often would you do that?
So again, if there are concerns, you can always have an amendment and bring the IEP team together and have a conversation. But at minimum, you are required to have this conversation during that plan review. New term, thank you CalPads, because we used to say annual review. So the annual IEP, now called the plan review, we would discuss statewide assessments, accessibility tools, and or the need for an alternate assessment. So at the annual IEP, now called the plan review, would be the minimum. But of course, whenever there is a concern, a suspicion, a need, you can always call the IEP team and have an amendment to discuss.
Here's a good one that I know we're going to hit on day 3, but I think it'd be important to address it. So if the student is receiving ELD within the general education population, does the IEP still need an ELD goal?
Okay. So this is a great question, and yes, we will catch up on day 3. I want to get my days correctly. So all things IEP related and focus on the IEP in relation to English learners with the disability will happen on day 3 of this particular series, because you're heading us into linguistically appropriate goals and objectives. So just to demystify all of those questions, we do not require, or I should say not we, IDA, CDE, you do not require a ELD goal in your IEPs, but rather we want to ensure that all IEP goals are linguistically appropriate so that we take into consider the students' English language acquisition needs, their baseline in accordance with their English language proficiency as noted on the ELPAC or on the alternate, and utilize that in conjunction with our baseline from our Common Core state standards, your curriculum and assessment tools, as we look at both of those baselines for English language proficiency as well as that curricular area that you're focused on, and then develop a goal that's linguistically appropriate. So linguistically appropriate goals are infused, embedded both standards and ELD standards as we look at the development of English for students in that particular goal, not a standalone goal for ELD. That's out. So we'll get to linguistically appropriate goals because I know that's a hot topic. It's just not today. I'm so sorry. But if you have any other frequently asked questions, and again, if you want to read up on linguistically appropriate goals, please go over to Chapter 5. Delve into the frequently asked questions for Chapter 5. On our website, we have each of the frequently asked questions by chapter. Just click on that accordion and find that question. The frequently asked questions are very useful tools. If you haven't perused them yet, we highly recommend it. This helps, again, build that conversation and building common language amongst special educators, EL specialists, and general educators, as again, we leverage also our support of each other, our support of teachers and practitioners in the field as we work to improve outcomes for English learners with disabilities. So having said that, we're going to jump into Chapter 2. So Vanessa will take you on a journey through Chapter 2, and I will be watching out for any questions in the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's do the switch here. So we're going to go into now Chapter 2 of the California Practitioner's Guide. Again, this chapter falling within Section 1, which is Identification of English Learners, MTSS, and Pre-Referral Interventions. Now we're going to be looking specifically at Chapter 2. So in Chapter 2, same structure that we discussed earlier as far as a companion guide. We've also developed a Chapter 2 infographic that works in tandem with Chapter 2 of the California Practitioner's Guide, where it lays out visually the content and topics, as well as appendices and figures contained within Chapter 2 to support your reading and your processing of the information contained within. So there are basic questions addressed in every single chapter, and the structure will be similar chapter to chapter. You'll have questions that relate to administrators and questions that relate to teachers, and this will then guide how it is that we go in through the topics and themes related to Chapter 2 and the subtopics addressed within. Chapter 2 specifically focuses on the MTSS framework, and that framework is designed to support all students. And the basic question that exists within the MTSS process is, what must be explicitly leveraged in California's MTSS framework to specifically support English learners? The chapter as a whole addresses these questions and provides guidance for a systematic pre-referral process to avoid the issue of over-identification or under-identification of English learners for special education services. So we're going to switch things around now. Chapter 1, we were looking at students with an active IEP who had qualified for special education services under one of the 13 distinct disability categories, or 2 of them if we have a situation where a comorbidity exists. Now we're looking at the opposite. Now we're looking at English learners who may be considered for referral, for assessment, to make a special education eligibility determination. So we're looking at the processes leading up until that point where we decide that a referral for assessment may be appropriate. Again, a referral for assessment, not direct placement. So we're going to walk through that process. So we want to start off with this right now familiar figure. I think many of us have seen one iteration or the other of the MTSS framework. Remembering always that the MTSS framework is not just the Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. It is, in fact, a framework. We're looking at response to intervention at the MTSS process, at positive behavioral supports. We're looking at all of that within that framework. If you'd like additional information related to the California MTSS, head on over to OCDE or SUM's initiative, and additional resources related to the MTSS framework will be provided for them. So the basic tenet when we're considering MTSS as we know it, as we discuss it, as part of the pre-referral process, we're looking at that pyramid structure, right? Where we have all students, some students, and few students. To relate it to prior learning, I want you to think back to the accessibility resource graphic, right? So again, I'm big on trying to make connections for all of us. So when we consider back to the UDAs, universal tools, designated supports, and accommodations, those universal tools are available to everyone. No need to turn it on, no need to make a recommendation, it's just available to everyone. Same thing with that tier 1 of the MTSS framework, right? When we talk about all students, we're talking about all. No specifics, no recommendations, they're just there. It's part of the first best instruction. When we're considering tier 2, we're talking about some students, right? Not to say that some are excluded, but only those who meet specific criteria established by any MTSS team, group of individuals that are collaborating, that are developing the systems that determine what the system looks like within your LEA, within your COE, within your individual school site. So you're considering all of these things now. And then we move over to few students, those accommodations, right? However, the caveat here is that when we talk about tier 3 in the MTSS framework, tier 3 is not special education. Repeat, tier 3 is not special education. And we like to use these opportunities to myth bust or demystify certain held beliefs when we're talking about MTSS, right? Where, okay, well, they already received tier 1 supports, tier 2 supports, it's time for SPED because they're ready for tier 3. That's not necessarily how it works. And it's important to realize this so that when we are engaging in pre-referral activities, when we are intervening in concrete specific areas that individual students might need support in, that we're not seeing this as one stepping stone from one level to another, rather a series of activities, a series of supports, a series of interventions that are built within the system, knowing that students can travel up and down for one content area, 2 content areas, or all content areas. Again, it's very fluid and very dependent on the individual students and their demonstrated areas of relative need. So to get a little bit more clarity on the California MTSS design elements, the practitioner's guide included figure 2.3. So figure 2.3 gives you more detail and a deeper explanation as to what these tiers of high quality core instruction are, including supports and interventions. Notice the word core, meaning that it is available for all students. The same tenet that holds true for special education, meaning that special education students are general education students first. Same holds true for students who are identified as having a disability and who are also English learners. They have access to core instruction. So when we consider ELD, ELD is part of core instruction, a basic access available to all English learners, including those that are English learners with disabilities. So when English learners are not making progress in academic achievement, teams of educators come together and must ask themselves whether the student's instruction, which includes comprehensive ELD, remember it's twofold, designated and integrated, has been evidence-based, standards aligned, and culturally and linguistically appropriate, and whether it has been of sufficient quality. Later on, we're going to see a graphic that details how language is at the core of all content areas. So if the student is struggling in one content area or multiple content areas, if language is at the core, where does language instruction take place? ELD instruction, comprehensive ELD, both designated and integrated. Going back to what each of these does, remember designated is that set aside protected time where the focal standards are the ELD standards, whereas integrated ELD are those English language development supports that are embedded through content areas where the ELD standards exist in tandem with content area standards. So, first question to ask yourself as you're engaging in this conversation and in reflection and in having these critical conversations about determining interventions that are evidence-based, How has the ELD instruction been provided? We are considering the quality, whether it's been standards aligned, and whether it's been sufficient. So all of these questions, again, at the back of our mind as we are addressing the individual student profiles, as we are considering potential intervention activities, and perhaps in the future, if no results are seen, pre-referral activities. When I mentioned earlier, first best instruction, I want us to think about UDL. If you want to learn more about UDL, we provided links in the Padlet and also in the slide deck that by clicking will direct you to the CAST website with more information on the UDL principles and the framework. But the core concept that I want us to get from our time together today and the inclusion of this UDL graphic here is that we're looking at UDL as Tier 1 inclusive academic instruction, meaning that it is inclusive of all learners. English learners, students with disabilities who are also English learners, and everybody else in between. So when we're considering the UDL guidelines, we're taking again into account the individual student learner variance, learner difference, language proficiency, disability category, and designing a system with which to develop our own instructional practices, opportunities, and activities that provide students with multiple means of engaging, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. So what we're trying to develop is a system that addresses not just that mythical average, but rather that designs considering the two ends of the spectrum. Because when we target those two ends of the spectrum, we have a greater chance of reaching that in-between as the best first instruction. And this in itself is our starting point as we're determining what supports might be necessary as we move up and down the tiers of support within the MTSS framework. Because we really want to ensure that we're being culturally and linguistically responsive. The California Practitioner's Guide embeds throughout the document the importance of the English Learner Roadmap and its principles as well as its corresponding elements. So when we consider the EL Roadmap, one of the big areas of focus as we are engaging students and developing quality 21st century instruction for our students who are English learners, which includes English learners with disabilities, we want to ensure that we are addressing exemplars. And one of the exemplars that they point out is CCRTL and their VAB framework. The VAB framework referring to validate, affirm, build, and bridge, which covers different dimensions of identity. Because as we are considering the student profile, we want to consider all of the elements that make up who the student is, who he or she is. And this includes culture, gender, ethnicity, language, disability, race, sexuality. All of these different elements need to be considered as we aim to develop interventions in identified areas of need once it's been determined or established that that individual student requires more above and beyond that Tier 1 instruction. Going back to the previous slide where we went over EL typologies, we understand that no group, including English learners, are monolithic. We have new arrivals with limited education, new arrivals with adequate schooling, new arrivals developing quote unquote normally, those who are at risk at becoming long-term English learners, and those who are already long-term English learners. So considering all of the elements of identity as shown in the previous slide, also including the EL typologies, on top of that language proficiency, on top of that disability category, on top of that manifestation of that disability across contexts and content area is going to be critical as we start thinking of these intervention activities that are going to be provided for students who are demonstrating some difficulty in academic tasks. And again, just to point out how intertwined these two are. So there is a large intersection of the EL roadmap and the California Practitioner's Guide. Every single element of the EL roadmap is embedded throughout the California Practitioner's Guide, from systems to high quality education to culturally and linguistically relevance. All of that is embedded throughout, because at the end of the day, I cannot emphasize this enough, English learners with disabilities have access to all things that English learners in general have access to. So again, that comprehensive ELD, designated integrated, applies to English learners and English learners with disabilities, and all of the ways in which we aim to connect with families, with students, develop systems and structures to support and align what is best for our students who are English learners and English learners with disabilities really do come together and coexist in these two documents and are embedded throughout. And you will see how it also becomes salient in the different areas where we start discussing specifics to English language learner needs and the intersection of disability as well. So I mentioned earlier that there are 4 basic EL roadmap principles, and we've also included a link to the fabulous resources developed by Californians together. We have access to some of the videos and then also some of the pamphlets that go in depth with the different principles and the corresponding elements with each of the 4 principles. So we have the 4 principles visible here, from assets-oriented to needs-responsive schools, intellectual quality of instruction and meaningful access, and system conditions that support effectiveness, and finally that alignment and articulation within and across systems as we aim to provide quality education for English learners. Knowing that our students who are English learners with disabilities have access to all of these elements of culturally and linguistically sustaining pedagogy, Figure 2.6 of the California Practitioner's Guide provides a resource where we can address linguistic segregation and implicit bias. So Figure 2.6 provides a framework for culturally and linguistically sustaining pedagogy that recognizes and uses cultural and linguistic knowledge from the home and the community, their own experiences, frames of reference, worldviews, and also integrates the history and the culture of the students into the curriculum. All of these students that are within our classroom settings, that valuing of language, viewing what they bring to the classroom as assets is incredibly important as we develop curriculum and opportunities for them to engage with the learning and to apply knowledge of language learning. Additionally, healthy perceptions of cultural and linguistic identity advanced through academics proficiency and critical awareness, and the development of personal efficacy and cultural pride. So all of these elements allow us to address linguistic segregation and implicit bias by taking an inward look and using it as a resource as we're developing our own teaching and learning opportunities for students who are dually identified. Now, when it relates to long-term English learners, there are critical considerations that need to be taken into consideration, pardon the redundancy, when we look at Tier 1 instruction. So long-term English learners need to receive an intensified focus on academic development. So notice how we're talking about academic development here, looking specifically at Part 2 of the California ELD standards, which is understanding how English language works, especially within the context of disciplinary texts and an engaging and meaningful interaction. We're going to start taking a look now at the ELD standards because we've been talking about English language learners. We obviously have to hit on the English language development standards because it is these standards that guide our designated ELD instruction, and it is these standards that work in tandem with content standards as we aim to develop integrated ELD instruction. So these are the critical principles of the California ELD standards, and the Practitioner's Guide provides you with Figure 2.7, which lays out the structure as this one-page document where you can see Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. Now, all of the information you need to know is contained there. However, I'm a firm believer in the value of a visual. So if you're a visual learner like I am, this helps really structure and process what it is that the ELD standards aim to do. So the ELD standards are divided into 3 parts, with their focus being meaning making. If we look at part 1 of the ELD standards focus specifically on interacting in meaningful ways, meaning interaction between individuals and groups of people. When we aim to interact in meaningful ways, we are collaborating, we are producing, and we are interpreting. So part 1 of the ELD standards focus specifically on that. Part 2 is all about learning about how English works, from structuring cohesive texts, connecting and condensing ideas, to expanding and enriching ideas. I want us to notice this arrow that exists between part 1 and part 2. This is a visual reminder that these don't exist in a vacuum. They really do build upon each other. You cannot do just one without doing the other. Why? Because in order to collaborate, that collaboration needs to be based on something, right? And you have to embed within how it is that the English language works. Now, I want to call your attention to this bottom section of the slide if you are joining us on Zoom or if you're here in person with us, where it says part 3, using foundational literacy skills. So part 3 doesn't have any specific standards attached to it, but it refers to foundational literacy skills. So those content standards found in grades K through 5 that address phonemic awareness and all of those basic reading standards. And that is what part 3 does. So part 3 is a focus on foundational literacy built upon that alphabetic principle. Running across part 1 and part 2 and on top of part 3, you'll see some arrows that go across the levels: emerging, expanding, and bridging. And that's to remind us that this is a continuum. So the students may be on a language development continuum. They might be emerging towards expanding, so the level of linguistic supports that you're providing for them to access interacting in meaningful ways and learning about how English works in an ELD setting might look a little bit different depending on text, task, and purpose. So again, just a very meaningful way to look at how the ELD standards are structured, and this resource is fantastic and we use it often, and it's out of UC Irvine and Orange County Region Common Core ELA Literacy, and with the support of Elvira Armas and Magali Lavadens. Great resource to help you visualize how it is that the ELD standards are structured and supportive of our practice as we are aiming to develop language proficiency for our English learners. So knowing how it is that the standards are structured and the purpose of each of those parts it's important. However, we really want to consider certain questions to just hone in on our lesson planning opportunities and our lesson planning activities and the delivery of our lessons in general. So considering the English language proficiency level of your students is going to be important. So let's talk a little bit about designated ELD. So in designated ELD, it's a protected time, and we want to group like level of students during that time. However, we know that students don't come in perfect groups of 30 or 25. So when you are planning your instruction, it's critical for you to know, especially in designated ELD, where it is that the group of students you are working with is at, because that's going to determine the type of linguistic supports that you're going to provide for them and how it is that you're going to address your entry point into those ELD standards. Because we know that there is one standard, however, there is that emerging, that expanding, and that bridging level. So you want to know how exactly you are addressing the standards and how you are developing the student. Going back to linguistics 101, right? Comprehensible input, I+1. We want to know where our students are so that we can then build their proficiency across. The second framing question is, which ELD standards amplify the Common Core State standards for ELA or literacy at the particular student's proficiency level. I like to give concrete examples because oftentimes things can seem a little nebulous, but if we consider real life examples that I'm sure a lot of us can think of, let me give you one for example. So if we have a student who is at the emerging level, level one data point. This student is a 5th grader. Okay, second data point, I can have an idea of what those 5th grade content standards are. Disability category, SLD. In writing, okay. Long-term English learner. Now I have a student in that same class who is not a long-term English learner. Everything is the same except they're a new arrival. So when I'm considering which ELD standards amplify the content standards at the student's language proficiency level, the supports that I'm going to be providing are going to be completely different. Because if my student who is a long-term English learner is just not making progress appropriately, that begs additional questions. However, because they've had more access to the English language, I could use English to explain certain concepts, whereas with a newly arrived student, I don't have that ability to use English to explain concepts. So I would need to rely on primary language supports to relate information to that student, to be able to integrate a lot more visuals, a lot more substantial linguistic supports to make input comprehensible, accessible, and then actionable. So what language might be new for students and or present challenges? Again, with that student who is a long-term English learner, they might have some of that basic interpersonal communication language, whereas the other student might not have that. So academic language might pose some difficulties for my long-term English learner, and the same would hold true for my newly arrived student. However, maybe with my newly arrived student, if I know that Spanish is their primary language, and I know they have a developed Spanish language where I might employ the use of cognates, then that level of support that I could provide for that newly arrived student who has a strong primary language base, who has access to primary language, academic language, I might be able to employ some of those cognates. So again, these are different points for us to consider as we're engaging in discussion on how to lesson plan for students with different English language proficiency levels according to text, task, and purpose. So here it is, figure 7.1, and it's true for all content areas. Language is at the core of all curriculum. If you are reading text and your fluency is at grade level, but if you don't have the vocabulary, the language to make sense of what it is that you're decoding, correct words per minute will not matter. You need language to make those connections. Language is at the core of all curriculum. And the way this figure is structured is to draw your attention to the center. And at the center of it all is what? The ELD standards. And they are present in all areas. They are present in all disciplines. And again, it's that direct connection. Without language, we cannot make meaning. Language is about meaning making. It's about processing and producing language expressively and processing it receptively as well, so that we are able to engage in language tasks that are oral language dependent and written language dependent. Because all English learners, including English learners with disabilities, need to have access to integrated and designated ELD. These are part of an English learner's core instruction, that tier 1. So ELD instruction should be happening in that tier 1, with designated being that set aside time, that protected time where ELD standards are the focal point, and integrated ELD is in essence what happens in all other content areas, with those linguistic supports embedded, built in to those lessons, dependent on where the student is as far as their proficiency level refers to. So integrated ELD is taking place in science time. Integrated ELD is taking place in math time, taking place in language arts. It's taking place in history. It's taking place throughout the day. Think of students who rely on a visual schedule, maybe not necessarily because of disability category, but because of language needs, language demands, linguistic supports. So if they need to go to band at a certain time and they still cannot make a lot of connections with band, a picture of their instrument or a picture of the cafeteria, those language supports that will facilitate the processing of information and interaction throughout. Same thing with maybe a journal for mathematics, where students are encouraged to cut out images, or students are encouraged to draw things out so that things can have meaning for them depending on what content area is being covered. If you are a history teacher, embedding videos throughout for students, that is all part of integrated ELD, supporting students in making meaning, all of the supports that you're building in related to English language proficiency, text, task, and purpose, and disability category. Though we're not yet there yet in this chapter. I keep mentioning that just because that is our bread and butter. But at this point, we're talking about English learners who may be referred for assessment. But keeping that in mind, if there's a suspected area of disability, if you're noticing, like patterns of relative weakness in relation to other areas, you really want to not sweep that under the carpet, but start really engaging where that might be coming from, right? And developing supports that might be appropriate depending on where the student is in regards to their language proficiency. So let's take a poll. All of this talk of MTSS. Can students with IEPs receive supports in Tier 1, Tier 2, and or Tier 3 intervention groups? Can students with an IEP receive supports in Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3? Yay, nay, dunno. Drop it in the chat. And survey says, yes. Students with an IEP have, in fact, access to general education interventions. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. As any other student. And this is in addition to their special education services and related services. Their IEPs take this into account, and it should be part of a comprehensive plan. So again, students with an IEP can partake in Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. And also they may be highly mobile within those tiers. So how is that determination made? Data, specific data that indicates an area of need. Because if a student is struggling with the reading, we need to know what element of reading it might be. Are we talking about phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, oral comprehension, reading comprehension? We need to have data to support why they're going to the reading intervention and why that reading intervention aligns to their identified area of need. If the reading intervention is focused on developing fluency, but the student's issue is not fluency, it's more understanding the vocabulary, the content of what's being read, then they're not receiving the intervention that they need. So as a reminder, and I can't drive this enough home, both integrated and designated ELD are part of an English learner's core instruction. So now I'm going to hand it over to Debbie, and she's going to walk us through a Jamboard activity.
Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. So as you reviewed tiers of support, tiers of intervention, and you're thinking in your mind more a visual representation other than a triangle, but more of a pyramid. When we think about the extensive needs that students may have as it relates to behavioral needs, academic needs, and needs as a student who is an English learner. As Vanessa touched upon, we have students, again, who are all in this category of English learners. However, their level of English language acquisition may be very different. English learners as a group is not a homogeneous group. Our students who are English learners are unique. Students with relative strengths, relative weaknesses, assets, and skills. And as we take into consideration the value of all that our students bring to our doorstep when they enter our schools, we consider again what are the tiers of support that exist within our respective communities. Given your particular school site, you may find that you have maybe a more robust SEL, mental health, behavioral health system as you look at the needs of your community. The same may be true. You may be a community who has many English learners, students who are newcomers and immigrant families, where you may need to, again, understand that tier 1 is your core, best first instruction, but then our interventions at tier 2 and tier 3 are much more explicit to ensure that students are served well, and that we don't over-identify nor under-identify English learners as a potential student with a disability, as language difference versus disability is a thing, and we'll touch upon that in day 2. But as we know, language difference in and of itself is not a disability. Language difference in and of itself does not make a student eligible for special education supports and services. And language difference in and of itself does not substantially impede learning as to meet the definition of a disability under 504 either. So I wanted to be very clear because I know that those are questions that come up frequently. If you have a question, please put it in the chat box. But we have a Jamboard activity next. So please do click on the Jamboard. Once you click on that link, you'll make a copy of it for you to keep. You'll use it today, and then additionally, you can share it with your school site, your district, your professional learning community. Again, share as you see appropriate. You can reuse this activity. For right now, all you're going to do is click on the link, and in the Jamboard, you'll take a sticky note. You'll see there on that left-hand side, the sticky note icon. You can take a sticky note and go through the slides of what are your tier 1, what are your tier 2, and what are your tier 3 supports as you keep in mind the needs of English learners. Also considering again tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, which may include specific supports and interventions, or should I say include specific supports and interventions for your English learners who may have social emotional needs, perhaps behavioral needs, as behavior is communication, and academic needs. So again, list out what exists right now, just a free flow of what comes to mind, what exists in your respective system, whether you're at the COE, SELPA, district, or school site level. Tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 supports as they exist. We'll give you about 3 minutes or so just to start adding your stickies, because we will come back to it. So you may be finding that you're quickly moving through tiers of support, listing interventions. At this point in time, you also may be generating some wonderings of what other tiers of intervention may exist, what your tiers of intervention might look like for students in your respective system. And this activity really is just to get the free flow of thinking of what exists within our system. Because as we move forward and touch upon tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 supports, you may again be considering what exists, what may be missing within your respective tiers of support, to help guide you again, not from the frame of we're missing something, it's not working, but rather highlighting what is working, what are promising practices, And where could we potentially add additional supportive practices where potentially we need more interventions based on the needs of the students whom you serve in your respective system at your school site, COE, SELPA, again, taking into consideration also your respective role and how you engage and interact in those tiers of supports, or how you may be a support provider to other practitioners in the field to ensure that interventions are applied with fidelity and ensuring that students, again, are referred appropriately. So having said that, as noted before, Tier 1, and I think Vanessa and I, we probably sound like a broken record when we emphasize comprehensive ELD, both designated and integrated ELD as core, basic floor of services. So as you consider our administrators who maybe are also writers of the LCAP, and you're considering what are basic services for English learners, that's where, again, comprehensive ELD exists for all English learners. So as we move up the tiers of support to Tier 2 interventions, Figure 2.1 is a very helpful resource. And if your system, you were having a bit of a struggle, let's say, in identifying Tier 2 supports as you looked at your Jamboard, this might be a figure to help build dialogue amongst your school-based team, to have conversations of what Tier 2 is and what Tier 2 isn't. Sometimes what we find is that Tier 1 basic supports and adjustments, scaffolds, whether temporary or ongoing, live in Tier 2 as opposed to Tier 1. And then we consider where is Tier 2 if we then skip over to Tier 3. So this helps give you an idea of what Tier 2 is and what it isn't, and ensuring that we're maintaining true to Tier 1 universal supports, designated supports, when we think of all of our UDL practices within Tier 1. And then again, knowing that Tier 2 interventions are in addition to the students' service and provided in designated and integrated. So we're leveling up, if you will, the levels of support, increasing intensity, or perhaps frequency of an intervention as we move into Tier 2 and those considerations. We're dropping the link in the chat box for you for 2.11. Let's give you about 2 minutes just to skim through what Tier 2 is and what it isn't. Thank you. So as you review Tier 2, what it is and what it is not, there were some questions here in our in-person group regarding, again, when and where designated ELD is occurring, what does integrated ELD look like, and it's also having me reflect on one of the questions that was in the chat box regarding the use of primary language resources, and specifically for students with disabilities. So if we consider, again, first all students as general education students and EL services, comprehensive ELD as the core basic services for all English learners, we consider that as English learners are English learners and need supports regardless of content area. So as we consider integrated ELD, which occurs across content area, where students may require primary language resources. As you think back to this morning when Vanessa described the levels of linguistic support, whether mild, whether moderate, or extensive levels of linguistic support, one of the questions that was in our chat box earlier was, what if no one on my staff or myself is not bilingual? We're not able to provide any translation or front-loading clarification in the child's primary language. In those particular instances, you may look for other modalities to provide that same level of primary language support if needed and necessary by the student. And that's why it's so important that we have an understanding of the student's proficiency level. Their performance on the ELPAC may glean us some information, and if they took or are going to take the alternate ELPAC, again, we would utilize all of their supports and tools. But as we consider primary language supports and resources, it may be that it's a resource as well as maybe a software, an application, whether on their Chromebook, on their phone, on another device, that can support and supplement the translation to the child's primary language, as we know that's an asset, a skill, a cultural background that the student brings that can definitely help bridge into English language acquisition. It may be printed resources, pictures, visuals, objects. It may be a video that has captions in the primary language, or they can be listened to in the primary language to front load a content or a theme that the student has not been exposed to previously. So really, as you consider integrated ELD and the needs of your student, we're keeping in mind the English language development standards. We're considering, again, opportunities for students to collaborate, produce language in meaningful ways and meaningful contexts, as we're also considering safe places for our English learners. As we understand that students whom are English learners, and specifically I say to our students who are newcomers, new to our schools, new to the US, where they may have other additional challenges with integrating, with understanding our cultural norms, with feeling fully included and safe to engage in those collaborative conversations. We want to prepare them also. So we may be considering our social emotional needs. Students now having come back to in-person learning, as we think about social emotional supports at Tier 1 and here at Tier 2, where again we increase perhaps the intensity, the duration, the frequency of those services and supports in Tier 2, given the respective needs of the student. So that comes back to the question of designated ELD. And what if, again, the designated ELD is occurring in tandem, in conjunction with a course, for instance, science? So my good friend here is a director at a high school level where science may be where the designated ELD is occurring. And in that particular scenario, we were having a discussion that I wanted to share with you all, which was that in this particular scenario, science, and I love the way Vanessa always frames things, science is your vehicle. And ELD standards are at the forefront. So ELD standards are the focus, and they're the, if you will, the true driver, the emphasis of what language looks like, where students are being given opportunities to produce, make meaning, expand on context, and work on their English language acquisition, while the content of science is simultaneously being utilized. So it's, consider this Common Core state standards for your subject matter as you layer on top of your ELD standards, so that in conjunction, the opportunities for building and understanding English as a language and producing that language are occurring in that environment. So it's not to say that it's void of content from a curricular area, but based on your respective school sites, what designated ELD looks like, what time of the day it occurs, what the protected minutes are and time, those again refer to your EL master plan. Have conversations if you yourself are not the EL specialist for your district or for your county office or your school site, because those are the questions again that might help inform your practice or the wonderings that you might have about your own system. Your EL master plan will have clearly delineated what your plan is as a district, approved by your board, of what designated ELD should look like, what is your adopted ELD curriculum, how supports have been provided. That's the other question. Has professional development amply been provided to all teachers, general educators, and special educators to fully understand the ELD standards, the implementation of your adopted ELD curriculum, the assessments that are part of that curriculum? Because again, that is core service. As we consider Tier 2, that may be, again, a subset of teachers who maybe uniquely have additional depth and breadth of training to provide Tier 2 interventions for English learners with disabilities. So then as we go to the next layer, as we increase perhaps duration, frequency of supports and services to students in Tier 3, we want to ensure that, again, we had a strong basis of Tier 2 and our Tier 3 supports. And as noted before, Tier 3 is not special education. Special education occurs outside of these tiers of support. So I like to think of it as that pyramid: social, emotional, and behavioral supports, academic supports, English learner supports, as we need, again, varying depths of supports based on the needs of students. So then Tier 3, again, that intensive, maybe a very small group of students, perhaps even some individualized services and supports via a counselor, a speech therapist assisting with other students who are in language acquisition, maybe newcomers, but not special education. Assessments are occurring with greater depth and frequency in Tier 3 also, as we're looking uniquely at specific areas where concerns are identified. We're focusing in with that magnifying glass of what are the areas of relative weakness for the student. So not necessarily a deficit or a disability, but we all have relative strengths and weaknesses, all of us, myself included. And when we look at profiles of students individually, we can then focus where is that need or that gap in their learning where we can intensify services at Tier 3. I'm going to give you a few minutes to read this particular diagram, which shows difference, and again, not exhaustive, but it does show some examples of differences between Tier 2 and Tier 3. Let's give you about 3 minutes to review this particular figure, which is 2.12. So just a quick read as you read through differences between Tier 2 and Tier 3. I wanted to restate and reemphasize that Tier 3 is not special education. Tier 3 would be, again, your intensive supports for students, again, receiving general education, curriculum, supports, and services. Your Tier 3 may include your students who are receiving supports and accommodations via a 504 plan, because as we know, students on a 504 are students receiving general education supports and services. Again, I have to restate that having a language difference, so a primary language other than English, is not a criterion for qualifying for a 504 in and of itself. To qualify for a 504, you must have a disability that substantially limits a major life area, which could be learning, and others to qualify for a 504. So students on a 504, which is not special education, may be served again in Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. Again, special education students with IEPs outside of these tiers of support, but may also receive interventions that exist within your Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. So there was a question in the chat box regarding in Tier 2, and I think in Tier 1 there was references to broader skills, which we were identifying as executive functioning skills, where students may, again, not have a disability or may have a diagnosis or condition that doesn't raise to that level of 504 or IEP, or maybe it does, but could still receive supportive structures. And I think of programs like AVID, where students are taught explicitly to take notes, how to be organized, to provide engagement. When we also think about universal design for learning and all the strategies that we ensure for engagement, the hows and the whats of learning, so that students, again, their needs are met at both that intrinsic basic level, and then we consider, again, all the extrinsic needs to keep our students focused in and able to access curriculum and instruction. When our students aren't receptive and their basic needs aren't met, again, our students will have struggles. So as we look at our tiers of interventions and support, it's all encompassing. We consider the needs of the student comprehensively, regardless of EL status, because we also have concerns about other basic needs. So again, given your community, you may find that you have a well-developed structure of Tier 2 supports and Tier 3 supports. Maybe you're considering, again, how to amplify and include greater amounts of interventions in Tier 2, because now we have something we're considering, which is learning loss at this point. So we want to ensure students receive more supports and not jump to a referral for special education if not warranted, because again, a language difference in and of itself is not a disability. There was also a great question in the chat box regarding students with greater levels of behavioral needs, where we may need to explore what are our behavioral interventions, our positive behavioral interventions and supports. What does that look like at your school site? Perhaps that's something that you have brought back to the forefront, having greater conversations, as you may be noting that students are having more behavioral needs as they return to in-person learning. Students who are in Tier 3 may have an FBA. There's a reference to functional behavioral analysis, and although, especially as school psychologists, I used to be a school psychologist many moons ago, and we think about, again, that as being part of special education. But students who are on a 504 are general education students receiving accommodations in general education, and they are entitled to an FBA should they have behaviors that are impeding learning. So we may have students on a 504 in Tier 3 receiving more intensified supports for their behavioral needs and perhaps an FBA to develop a behavior plan for them given that plan and those requirements. So different than IDEA and our requirements for an FBA and a behavior intervention plan. So just wanted to clarify because I thought that was a great question in the chat. I'm sorry, were there any other questions?
We have a question that asks specifically about what 6 to 8 and 8 to 12 OTRs per minute means. Yeah, okay, so I'll go ahead and I'll take that one.
Go ahead.
So 6 to 8 and 8 to 12 OTRs means opportunities to respond, which signals to wait time, processing time, right? So there will be a difference with opportunities to respond provided to students who are receiving Tier 2 interventions versus students who are receiving Tier 3 interventions. So again, one of the tenets of direct instruction, lowercase di, is related to giving students opportunities to respond and ensuring that, you know, that perfect practice makes perfect permanent, allowing for those opportunities to respond to be correct opportunities to respond. So the more that they're engaging and responding per minute, the more likely then that the effectiveness of it sticking and being remembered and then applied for the student, depending on the level of intervention being received, whether it be a Tier 2 or a Tier 3. So if you allow more practice, then that is more opportunity for the student. So let's say that the student is practicing in speaking, then that's more opportunity for them to speak and to use the language, to use the content. If it's in writing, same thing, more opportunities to write, to engage, to produce, so that it then starts becoming as part of their learner repertoire.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you, Vanessa. So as we consider also the cultural and linguistic needs of our students, we also want to ensure that we're staying safe to our students' cultural and linguistic practices as well, that we're taking into consideration as we check for understanding or providing opportunity to respond, that we again allow safe spaces for students. So whether that's peer-to-peer support, small group, or directly with whole class and with the teacher, we want to ensure that those opportunities truly are seen as opportunities for students to interact, to dialogue, as opposed to potentially punitive, shamefulness, or eliciting other feelings that students again may be having, given that they may be new to the environment, new to the classroom, new to the country, new to the culture. So as we consider all of these factors, again, we're embedding all of our levels of support. And we may see students who are English learners with increased behavioral needs, potentially because of those frustration, the frustration of not being able to communicate. And I always ask for this agreement with groups is that behavior is communication. When our behavior says something, and we just may not know what that is quite yet, but behavior is communication. Students are telling us something when they are having behavior, disengaged, uncomfort, anxiety, distress. All of those factors we also want to take into consideration. So the more that we know about our students, their cultural and linguistic background, when we include families, parents, and guardians into our school community to get a better understanding of their cultural norms and how we can continue to respect and help them build upon, not to remove. Because what we also know in the research regarding English learners and English learners with disabilities is that students can learn and pick up a new language. English learners with disabilities are able to retain their language and fully develop a new language. Sometimes that becomes a question of, well, should we just transition completely to English and be void of their primary language? The more we know about what our student brings to our school, when we looked at the roadmap, assets-oriented, needs-responsive. If we frame our lens to what are the needs of our students, can we be responsive to their cultural norms, their supports? And again, if in our school system we don't have the staff, we ourselves may not be bilingual in that student's language or dialect within the language, we may look to other resources. What exists within our community, in maybe the student's faith-based community, the community where they live, the environment. Again, are there others that we can invite into our space to help us learn more about the culture, to help provide us with translation support, again, so that we build supportive structures within our schools and include all students, ensuring access and equity for English learners and English learners with disabilities. So as you are considering Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, you may have some additional wonderings at this point. We're going to have you revisit the Jamboard. So go ahead and click on the Jamboard. You probably have it open still. You copied it and made it your own. At this point, I'd like you to reflect on the stickies you placed in your Jamboard at Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. And based on what you read in the figures, maybe it's time to reorganize. Perhaps some of the items that we believed were Tier 2 are Tier 1. And perhaps some of the items that were Tier 3 are Tier 2, or anywhere within that, again, range. So as you consider again and reorganize, I would ask you to reflect on positive practices, number 1. So what are we doing really well within our system? Because we want to retain things we're doing well, things that work for students, continuing on that technology, assistive technology and resources perhaps that were occurring during distance learning and integrating them in the classroom. Where does that exist in your tiers of support? And also to carefully acknowledge, where can we add additional interventions and support? And or where can we provide our own staff with additional supports to ensure fidelity to tiers of intervention and supportive structures for all students? So we'll give you about 5 minutes to come back, reflect, reorganize, and consider. So thank you. Okay, friends. So you've had some time to revisit your Jamboard, to reflect and consider what exists currently within your Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 interventions. At this time, you may also be reflecting upon what's maybe missing or some gaps in practices. I hope for our administrators, you've also taken some time to reflect on what is our ELD curriculum adoption? Has staff been fully trained and supported in the implementation of the ELD adoption? What does ELD look like for English learners and English learners with disabilities in respect to integrated and designated ELD? This particular Jamboard, I highly encourage, if this was an activity that you appreciated, share it. Share it with other friends. You did copy it. You can reuse it as you see appropriate. This might be a great next activity for your school-based team, your school site, or maybe your facilitator of EL specialists and special educators, maybe general education, whatever your respective role. This might give teams an opportunity to actively discuss what it currently exists within our tiers of intervention and where can we layer on supports where necessary. So I hope you found this to be a supportive tool to you and your work moving forward. So let's try a poll. Let's try a really quick poll. Do English learners who need interventions receive their ELD instruction during Tier 2 or Tier 3 intervention time? So do English learners who need interventions receive their ELD instruction during Tier 2 or Tier 3 intervention time? Go ahead and flood the chat and I'll give you a hint. It's a little bit of a trick question. So I'll wait a minute as you respond in the chat. ELD during Tier 2 or Tier 3? And the response there is no. So as we've discussed before, and we'll unpack it some more, and that's why I love these FAQs, because you can easily send an FAQ to a friend also. So if you're having wonderings at your school sites, the FAQs may be your entry point to develop further conversations and to answer hot topics that you may have had at your school site, within your COE, within your SELPA. So I'll read you the response as you see it there. Every student retains comprehensive ELD, both integrated and designated in Tier 1. And as we've noted during the course of today, truly emphasizing that comprehensive ELD occurs in Tier 1. It's a basic core service. and yet English learners may receive additional supports within the respective tiers of interventions to, again, support their instruction, their progress made in any curricular area that's identified as an area of relative weakness. So again, comprehensive ELD occurring in Tier 1. So some reflective questions for teams that you may want to take back. And much of our role and work is really to assist you, facilitate those conversations as you're discussing what may be missing in our environment, what again may be a challenge for us at our specific school site or school district. So these are just some reflective questions for your teams as you further explore this topic of serving English learners and English learners with disabilities. So as you see there, are we providing English learners enough time in Tier 2 and considering Tier 3? What does your Tier 3 look like? Again, knowing that Tier 3 is not special education, nor is Tier 3 necessarily when you refer to special education. A student may receive services in Tier 3, then move to Tier 2, may need heightened additional services, go back to Tier 3, again, all dependent on the need of the student and the decisions made by your student study team, your student success team. Maybe you're also calling it an English language acquisition team. Maybe it's all one grandmaster team, which would be wonderful because multidisciplinary teams is what we are truly hoping for. The general educators, special educators, EL specialists are together having these conversations regarding supportive practices for English learners and English learners who may be suspected of a disability or having a disability. So as you consider that last bullet, I truly want to share with you, so have culturally and linguistically responsive practices and specific language learning needs been considered? In session 2, so we hope you join us for day 2, we will be discussing language difference versus disability, taking more time with examples of the differences between. So with that, again, I hope you join us for section 2 of this particular 5-day series. As with all chapters, they end in student scenarios. In this particular chapter, though, they've switched the lens, which is very nice, for the practitioner's lens. So in these student scenarios at the end of chapter 2, you're going to hear or read the perspective of a teacher named Allison and a teacher named Jatinder. Based on your level, again, of how you support teachers, or if you're a teacher, practitioner, service provider yourself, depending on what you saw on your own Jamboard, you may have identified, I want to read more and know about Tier 2 interventions or Tier 3 interventions. So the way that we have this particular activity scaffolded, and you will do it independently because we are in a webinar format. So if you want to explore Tier 1 and positive behavioral needs and writing interventions, from the perspective of the teacher named Allison, you'll read pages 1 through 5. If you want to explore Tier 2 foundational reading skills interventions from the perspective of Jatinder, another teacher, pages 5 through 8. And then to explore Tier 3 interventions that are intensive from, again, teacher Jatinder's perspective on page 8 through 10. So we're going to give you 10 minutes to refer. These are rather robust scenarios for you to open the scenario that most resonates with you. You'll click on the link that's dropped into the chat and refer again to the section that you are most interested in. Then we'll follow up with a Q&A session as well. So again, 10 minutes to fully explore whether Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3 interventions and supports. So again, 10 minutes for you to explore. Thank you. As you read and reflected through the student scenarios, or I should say teacher scenarios in this respect, from the perspective of Allison or Jatinder, whichever particular area or tiers of support that you decided to explore, you may have noticed a common theme of data and data collection and the importance of targeted data, that we're honing in on what are the needs of the respective students in whether it was Allison's class or Jatinder that you read. Because as we want to ensure that teaching is intentional, that interventions are intentional, and that we have the assessment tools necessary in the assessment data to ensure that we're focused on the needs of the individual student, or small groups of students to ensure progress is being made. That may also lead you to reflect on what are the existing assessment tools that exist within your district. Are the assessment tools free or void of cultural and linguistic bias? Have we accommodated them so that those assessments are appropriate for the students who you serve? Do we have the right tools necessary to assess and to help us determine what are those entry points for Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 given the needs of students? Do we have a clearly articulated system across tiers of when to refer to the next level of support? In the scenarios that you reviewed, you may have also noticed that there was successive supports and that students were given opportunities to work towards and within those interventions in about 4 to 6 weeks, which is the recommended time to let an intervention work. So we can actually get some data on, did this intervention work for the student? Are further adjustments necessary? Did we implement that intervention with fidelity during that 4 to 6 week period? That we plan to come back and review and analyze that data. And then where necessary, determine are additional supports needed? Do we need to change to a different tier of support? And in one of the scenarios, you may have noticed that the student was referred for special education assessment, as the child Cruz may be eligible for special education supports and services. But again, those determinations and referrals aren't made lightly. They're based on data, on subsequent levels of data and interventions to help inform practice and to ensure that we are not inappropriately referring a student for special education solely based on language, but yet identify needs and concerns where the student may need greater supports. So again, those scenarios are there to assist and support you in your practice. You can utilize any of the resources back with your school-based team. So again, we support you in your work. Always flood the chat with any new learnings. We love to hear new learnings or maybe an aha moment that you had, as well as a promising practice, and of course any wonderings or questions. For the sake of time, we won't take a break right now. We're going to go ahead and push through and hope we can let everyone out early. I know it's been a long day. But here are some broad areas for pre-referral. I do want to note that if you join us for day 2, it will be all things pre-referral and pre-referral systems. That will be the focus of our conversation as we lead into referral processes, language difference versus disability, acknowledging the needs of students, and then the students who may be referred and eligible for special education supports. So these would be the questions that you may take back to your district, to your school site, to your multidisciplinary teams, as again, you further discuss what are our tiers of intervention, tier 2, tier 3, how do we consider the needs of our students, the cultural and linguistic needs, considering all extrinsic factors, as I mentioned earlier, looking at each and every one of our students as their comprehensive needs and identifying where we can provide support where necessary. So these particular questions in figure 2.3 may help you again if you're leading now into the wonderings regarding pre-referral and referral of students who may have significant challenges and where teams are having active conversations and determining that a referral for special education assessment may be appropriate. So again, these are broad areas of pre-referral review that we say maybe are some homework prior to our second session with you, where we will delve deeply into pre-referral and referral systems. As with each chapter, frequently asked questions in chapter 2 may assist and support you. You may leave today's session and think about, well, what was that question again? What was the response? The FAQs are on our website as well, and click on the accordion for that chapter. It'll give you some frequently asked questions and again, help and inform your practice and maybe a starting point for future talking points with yourself and your staff members in your respective role. With that though, before we let you go, we do want to give you a broad review of all of the resources that are found on our website and where to find any recorded modules, as you may have interest in other areas and you can't wait till the series is finished, which we completely understand because we have other recorded modules on our website.